哎，我跟不是这谁到底在打我锅？哎，我真的很讨厌。我听到了，你真逼感。哼，我说我这耳朵贼好，我这耳朵听力，我跟你说，现在，哎，听力是怎么说来的？听力评分是怎么评的？视力是1点几，耳朵怎么分贝？哇，这个好甜的，不太适合我说出来。我瞧着了，就我跟他了，我看你走不走？你敢不敢？哼，鹰眼。OK， 回来上班第一件事情，先小小的吃把鸡，丝毫没有任何难度。我决定今天做一个积极的宣传大使，我要把每一个跟我双排的队友都让他认识我的 idol。什么居然没变菜？我现在吃饭不吃菜了，咱们得赶紧走，待会儿我的排搭子拉我。你9星打不过，不好意思说。打不过游戏搭子，你看游戏搭子。啊！他们忘了我，他们自己在打。他们已经开局8分钟了，我现在王牌4000，我不配他们了。他们王牌9星，他们不加我，他们已经开局9分钟了。OK， 女人呢，忘人忘的就是快。走之前还说要记得我，走之后已经不找我了。我们浅浅的看一下他们跟谁在玩。我看我不在的这段日子是谁代替了我。OK， 2个不认识的男人非常好，只要不是多姐妹，男人无所谓。我们的地位不会废呀，压上了 skr。OK， 我们可以放心的去找一下我们的队友。男人不用担心，只要没有女人代替咱就可以。男人很动不了咱的地位。No problem。哎呀，等会我腿麻是什么问题啊？现在不要做拿铁的了，我的排泄气。我们来找一个 team 啊，阳气与烧。吃口但不高冷。OK， 他的名字非常的吸引我，但是我比较反骨，越吸引我的名字，我越不愿意进去。我就是我，不一样的烟火。不可能女生打男生的号，那说明什么？说明他们有男朋友，你有男朋友，有没有男朋友跟我都没什么关系。自信开麦。Hello， 你好，打吗？
哪个在讲话呀？
狼。
看到女生。
哎，对，嗨。
姐姐，你声音好好听。
哎，好。因为你是要钢枪还是上方啊？
我都行，都可以。
OK， 那我跟你飞。
Introducing you, a person who loves to live life to the fullest.
我也不知道
Your infectious personality is mere.
哦，行。
等会儿，那我现在等会儿我电话来了，等一会儿。
好，
我接个电话。
行。
OK， 先打个预防针。
飞机很快就要起飞了，
差不多各自一
各位
会儿。
特种兵，请准备。
先祭4代的折鹤，谢谢。谢谢我的宝贝女儿的西西送的520，谢谢我的宝贝女儿。
大咕噜酱，
是他在说话吗？
哈，
谢谢流年代的折鹤，谢谢花季的你的小脸，谢谢生菜代的折鹤，谢谢男生的 baby tandy， 谢谢男生，谢谢。谢谢恒的 Dream Happy City， 啊，我英格雷是真好，是吧？Dream Happy City， 哎，我 K 妹妹回来了。
花开又花落，就是 OK。跳这里，应该会有人。
妹妹，你觉得我的铃声老吗？
铃声我刚刚没有仔细听呢，还行呀，我感觉还行。什么歌呀？你跳这边。
啊，是，你刚没有听到是吧？2级的胆小鬼了，有听过吗？
哦，我听过。
啊，你听过？
胆小鬼。
谁唱的？
不老呀，我记得胆小鬼我之前好像还唱过呢，我还听呢。
你听的是谁唱的版本？
但是我已经很久没听了，我也忘了。真的这首歌我不怎么听。
那你知道他是谁唱的吗？
谁？
你唱过，你听过，但你不知道是谁唱的。
我不太记得，因为我不经常唱。但是我记得我唱过胆小鬼。记得。
这样。
有人小心点。
我给你等会儿。
拿起来的时候。
OK， 这个时候咱们帅气的把对面打完，然后咱们再帅气的告诉
你多大了呀？
稍微等会儿，我看先把这个打了。有个木乃伊啊。
OK。
小心，就在你的右边。你慢点。我怎么感觉我要嘎呀？我有种不太好的预感呢。亲爱的小妹妹，哎，请你哎，干啥打的我呢？
哇，6。
还好。
16的。
还有人。他过来了，你小心。
2个好像看到了。
2个。
对。
那上我
标记了一处地点。
在那里，有一个在那。
OK， 我听到了。我跟你一起。
这个是人机。
对，我听到了。我去问他要点药什么的。
好。
你别着急。
You've seen the equation, as I say. What you actually do when you do power analysis is you plug numbers in, and the statistical package will spit out the result. But what do you plug in? Like, what numbers should you put in? As we say, when we start, we don't know the effect size. We don't know, how do we figure out what the variance is? Where do we get these numbers to do the estimation? And what are some of the trade-offs that we have to make when we're in the middle of doing a design? That's what I want to talk about now. So this is the basic steps that you go through when you do power analysis. You set your desired power. Usually we do 80%, significance 95%. Right? That's the easy stuff. That's just what we do. Those are, just
才
traditional
6年
numbers.
吗？
Then you need to get
它是在
hold of
前面，
some
对。
data that is relevant to your population. And that might be from a study somebody else has done, it might be from national statistics, it might be from pilot data. Pilot data is a little bit of a problem because it tends to be, it's a pilot, so it's small, so you may not get very accurate measures of things like intercluster correlation and variance. So usually we usually use data from other studies or national data sources, and we calculate variance of the outcome of interest and intercluster correlation if we're doing a cluster design. Okay, so you just take this data and you calculate it, you run it through put the numbers into Stata or R, and it spits out variance and ICC.
死咱们要死的尊严
Then we decide the number of treatments we want to do,
帅
and we set the minimum detectable effect size. I'm going to come back
Wow.
to that a lot. That's going to be one of the most important things that judgment that we make. Put the numbers into Stata or R, and it
妹妹
spits out
平常
variance
很
and
喜欢
ICC.
唱歌吗？
Then we decide the number of treatments we want to do, and we set the
你唱
minimum
过
detectable effect
胆小
size.
鬼是吗
I'm going to come back to
要不要
that a lot.
再
That's
唱
going to
一
be
次？
one of the most important things that judgment that we make
哎，我记得那个
is
胆小
the
鬼好
minimum
像是那
effect
个
size
谁
we
唱
want to be
的，
able to detect between treatment and
不知道
control.
我唱来着
We decide the allocation
那个
ratio.
胆
We're
小
going
鬼
to
好
split the
像是
sample
叫
50-50 between
姓
treatment and
梁的
control,
唱的，好像
probably, and
有
calculate the
印
sample
象，
size. And most textbooks would then say you're done. Okay?
你有印象吗？
Then we estimate the budget, and we realize we can't afford it. I don't think there's ever been a study where I've done that and I'm done. Like, never. Like, the way it's presented in textbooks is, you calculate how much sample size you need and then you go do it. Well, there's always constraints on the amount of sample size. It may be the budget. It may be the fact that the implementing partner can only do 50 scores, right? So there's constraints on our sample size.
我觉得不，
So we go back and we say, what can we cut? What can we change? How can we change the design to get more power? Maybe we cut a treatment arm. Maybe we decide to randomize at the individual level instead of the cluster level. We go back and we adjust, and we repeat, until we come up with a design that makes sense. So this is not a one-off thing. It's like you go round and round and round, and it informs your design. And it's not like you do your design and then you do your power. You do your design and then you do your power, and you realize it's wrong, and you've got to go back and change your design. And that's kind of the process that we all go through.
我不
So
想洗
let's
啊。
think about some of the things we have to worry about as we go through this process.
注意卫生，那我们得
Yes.
拉尿，我拉尿。
So we talked about effect size, the
拉尿为什么没有洗
hypothesized
手啊
effect size
我只是脱
being
一下
important
裤
in
子而
power.
已，裤子又不
慢
脏。
慢
So that's
我觉得
what we're talking about. We're
怎么
talking about the
在
effect
这里
size.
神话
But
但是
as I'll go into a lot more
这
detail
种
about
更
how do we come up
更
with the
爱
right
好者
effect
不是
size.
这
What
么
effect
细的
size should we be putting in there? But the
对，不用说这么
name
细
of the
的
effect size we put in is the minimum detectable effect size. And that
CP
name actually tells us everything we need to
不
know.
是
It's the minimum that you will be
名字
able to detect.
哇，
Okay.
突然觉得我们俩关系好
So,
亲近
and
哦
that's。going to take a lot of judgment to figure out what that should be. Let's start with something slightly easier.
但也不必要就是说什么都告诉我，咱们得需要一点点
没有啊
安全距离。
Variance,
没
right?
关系，
So
都是女孩子。之前我打游戏的时候，碰到一个姐姐，然后那个姐姐就是她男朋友啊什么什
哎，
么
对对
的都跟
对对对对对，
跟我讲
妹妹呀，哇塞，哎，你看，这是什么？
啊，
这是光晕。
这个是啊，
哎，你看，你看白云，蓝天白云，像什么？
哦，
你
看到
刚才那个歌，那
像
个歌怎么唱来的？
胆小鬼，
哎，对，那个歌是谁唱来的？好像姓梁，对吧？
我给你搜一下，
哎，搜一下，搜一下，叫梁什么来的？
搜一下就知道了。
你搜，你搜，你搜。
花开又花落的。
这歌到底
梁
谁唱
咏？琪，
哦，梁咏琪。梁咏琪，哎，你认识梁咏琪吗？
我肯定不认识啊，人家歌手啊。
也对，人家歌手，咱们平民百姓怎么可能会
对呀
认识呢？说有道理。
对呀、人和人之间的差距。
也对，也对，也对，没毛病。妹妹，你等我去找个雷，什么东西自雷哈？就说
没关系，我
我说
看你打，
那你知
还跟聊天
道梁咏琪这个人吗？你有没有听说
我不
过他？
知道，
啊，
不知道。
你不知道？那
对啊，
我都不知道
你认。识他吗？
人家是歌手，我怎么会认识呢？
我以为你认识呢。
怎么可能呢？我认识还在这打游戏。
哦，我知道唱，我知道唱。喜
你知道他？
欢看你紧紧皱眉，叫我胆小鬼。你的表情大过于朋友的暧昧，寂寞的称谓，甜蜜的责备，有 独一无二，专属的特别，喜欢看你紧紧皱眉，叫我胆小鬼。我的心情就像和情人在斗嘴，奇怪的直觉，错误的定位，对你爱呀呀呀呀呀。
啊，妹妹唱的特别好，就是让我有一种想到大张伟的感觉，
怎么想大张伟？
就是哎呀啊啊，哎呀，对的
哎
话，
呀，哎
我的
呀，有人了，小心一点，他摇曳。我操，好牛！他队友来了不？我操，这是我第二次遇到这么牛逼的
那第一次是谁
女
啊？
孩子了。第一次是也是一个女孩子，
那他厉害，我厉害，
你厉害一点，
我厉害一
看
点，
操作能看得出来，厉害2点。
厉害2点，OK 也不错了，起码比他厉害2点。就是你这句话，我为你自个雷吧。
啊！别，我看你打，
只能让你等太久了。
没关系，我就想聊天而已，我不想打游戏的。
真的啊？
嗯，对呀，
嗯，好，
真的，
行，那我就再打会儿，那你再看会儿。
就怕你一个人打没安全感。
不，我应该，
嗯，
我应
但是看你打
不应该有
这么厉害，我就放心了。
啊？OK，没关系，我安全感还挺好的。嗯，喂，你刚刚唱的那个什么花开花，那是个啥？
花开又花落，那只是无奈的不舍。
这是个是最近是流行这歌了是吗？
嗯，
我怎么没听过这个？
哎，不对，不是这个。
谁唱的啊？
不知道，我只是会1-2句而已。
会哦，那你刚才那个胆小鬼，你会那么多句，很厉害喽。
我是在看手机。
那以前那也是听过嘛？你看手机就会唱，那也说明以前听过对吧？
唱过。
那首歌还蛮火的哈，大家都听过。嗯，我也觉得挺火的那首歌。但是完全不听。咩歌手啊？我突然想起那个那个司机师傅杨文 K， 咩 OK 啊？谢谢好的漏灯牌，谢小黄瓜的比心兔兔，谢赢了晚风的漏灯牌，谢谢吃鸡鸡的神枪手，谢谢。那你在看啥呀？
我在看视频。
你不是跟我聊天吗？
聊呀。
一边看视频一边聊。就一心做2个用。
我有时候打游戏的时候我也在看视频。
哦，有时候打游戏就一边刷视频，
边打
边刷视频，边聊
嗯
天。
嗯，
王妹妹，那你挺厉害，你跟哪吒一定是好朋友。 你不问我为什么？
为什么啊？
因为你有3头6臂。
3头6臂，花好上龙庄，好戏开场。
给我聊
我不知道为什么我打着打着就有点困了，你知道吧？
困了，那困了饿了喝东鹏特饮。没开玩笑，那要不你去睡？
姐姐你多大了呀？
啊，我25岁以上，不超过30。
哦。
We know that variance is important, so we need to get a good, accurate estimate of what the variance in our underlying population is. There's not much we can do about variance. Like, it is what it is. Like, if the variance, you know, if the height varies in the population, that's what it is. Okay. Remember that our problem with variance is that if we see differences between treatment and control, we don't know whether that's because we happen to get tall people in treatment versus control. So what might we be able to do to solve that problem and help us distinguish? Well, you know, again, our problem is at end line, we see taller people in treatment than in control, and we don't know whether that's because of underlying population variance and happening to pick taller people or because the program worked. What can we do to try and sort that out? One thing we can do is to get a baseline estimate and see whether we happened to pick taller people in treatment than in control at the beginning, and it looked like maybe we did in this case. And then we can account for this when we do our estimation, and accounting for the baseline gives us a more precise estimate. So what do I mean? I mean, we're going to include in our final estimation the baseline level of height, right? And then we're tracking this kid over time from the baseline to the end line. And we can see that in the control group, well, there's people of different heights. This kid started small, ended small. This kid started tall, ended tall, right? Now in the treatment group, we again control for the height at the baseline, and we see that this kid started quite tall, but ended up even taller. So we see that there's a change in height in the treatment group and not a change in height in the control. So we're helping to solve some of the problem of variance because we can tell how much of the difference at the end line came from difference at the baseline. David?
Is that always going to solve a variance issue or to take the baseline data?
It's going to improve the variance issue, the variance problem, because we're helping to explain some of the variance. So what we actually put, if we want to refine things, what we actually put in the power equation is not variance, but residual variance. The amount of the variation I cannot explain from everything else that I know about this population. So again, the reason variance is a problem is because of that I know about this population, that I know about this population, that I know. Amount of the variation I can.
没素质，不礼貌，打不过就骂人，你退，退退退，退，退，退，退，来呀，你过来。你们过来，来，来，过来，干嘛？来打我呀！来打我！大家好好着来。我说别跟你。哎，拜拜，谢谢闭麦，骂不到我，跑。气死你！
If we want to refine things, what we actually put in the power equation is not variance, but residual variance. The amount of the variation I cannot explain from everything else that I know about this population. So again, the reason variance is a problem is because of the risk that we may happen to pick successful kids for the treatment group. But if some of that variation can be explained by other factors, we know that older kids tend to be taller. We know that men tend to be taller than women. We know that educated farmers tend to have higher yields. Any of that variation in our outcome that we can explain by observable, we know that educated farmers tend to have higher yields. Any of that variation in our outcome that we can explain by observable factors is not going to be a problem. because we know that's not because of the treatment. So we can wipe that out, and we're left with the unexplained variance, and that's going to be the problem. Yeah, I mean, there's always uncertainty in the unexplained, but that's part of the equation too. That's part, right? So using controls, so it may not be baseline, it can be other controls, but anything that soaks up variation, that explains variation, means that we don't get confused in the final estimation. It increases the precision of our estimate. And given that we're going to have a more precise estimate, let's know that at the beginning, and let's figure out our sample, right? So higher yields, any of that variation in our outcome that the treatment group. But if some of that variation can be explained by other factors, we know that older kids tend to be taller, we know that men tend to be taller than women, we know that educated farmers tend to have higher yields. Any of that variation in our outcome that we can explain by observable factors is not going to be a problem, because we know that's not because of the treatment. So we can wipe that out, and we're left with the unexplained variance, and that's going to be the problem. Yeah, I mean, there's always uncertainty in the unexplained, but that's part of the equation too. That's part. Right? So using controls, or it may not be baseline, it can be other controls, but anything that soaks up variation, that explains variation, means that we don't get confused in the final estimation. It increases the precision of our estimate and given variance, and that's going to be the problem. Yeah, I mean, there's always uncertainty in the unexplained, but that's part of the equation. Explained by observable factors is not going to be a problem, because we know that's not because of the treatment. So we can wipe that out, and we're left with the unexplained variance, and that's going to be a problem. Yeah, I mean, there's always uncertainty in the unexplained, but that's part of the equation too. That's part, right? So using controls, so it may not be baseline, it can be other controls, but anything that soaks up variation, that explains variation, means that we don't get confused in the final estimation. It increases the precision of our estimate. And given that we're going to have a more precise estimate, let's know that at the beginning, and let's figure out our sample size based on that, right? So we calculate residual variance by regressing the outcome on controls in the existing data. So we have a national survey of, that has height and kids' ages and their gender, and even maybe their income levels or their ethnicity. We run the regression of all the things that we will have in the final endline data. So we have the outcome against a whole bunch of controls, only the ones that we will have in our endline data. We kind of mimic the regression we're going to do at the endline, and the residual variance is then what we put in. And on the whole, baseline variables tend to be the best control, because they already, the baseline level already takes into account the kid's age and the kid's gender and their ethnicity and whatever. So it's kind of all summarized usually in what they were in the baseline. I mean, that's not necessarily the case, but just having done a lot of these things, usually you don't get that much better.
哎，你打不着，哎，来，给我，来，嘿，6。牛，一点儿，你再给。哎呀，底叉叉。我这
practice start again if you see that in the baseline the treatment and the control have different values.
Good question. Have you done stratification yet? We talked about it, yes. So in practice, what we do is we make sure that we've stratified so that never happens. A, we've stratified enough, and B, we have a big enough sample so that never happens. Now, and partly because the statistics get a bit hairy if you randomize. It used to be the case that people would randomize differently. They used to randomize 100 times, pick the 20 times where it's balanced, and then randomize which of those 20 they used. That was a very standard way of doing LCTs. The econometricians came along and said, we're not completely sure what you're doing when you do that. You may be forcing correlations that we don't quite understand. That may slightly bias your estimates of the standard errors at the end. Please don't do that anymore. So I don't think practically it's a huge problem, but if there's anyone out there who says it's not valid, then it's a bit risky to do it. So now we've kind of stratified the hell out of things, so we're not in that situation. Now, there are times, including a time 2 weeks ago for me, where we had a very small sample. There's nothing we can do about it. We are randomizing the level of the radio station. There simply aren't that many radio stations. Like, we can't, that's an example of sample size. Like, there's that many different radio stations in the country we're working, and that's the best country to do an evaluation of radio stations. So we're stuck. So it was a bit hairy when we did that randomization. It could have been that we got unbalanced. We got baseline data on everything. We worked incredibly hard to stratify as much as possible, but there were only a few radio stations, so there was only a limited amount that we could do. if that had turned out really badly, I would have re-randomized. Because for me, I felt like it was worth the risk of some econometrician saying, well, maybe the standard error is slightly different, versus if it was completely different between treatment and control, and you then spend like $1 million doing the RCT, I mean, I just wouldn't have done it. And I've seen people who've gone ahead in that situation, and I don't think that was the right decision.
这谁啊？
But the real answer is don't do RCTs with 18 clusters like I'm doing, and you know, stratify the hell out of it. And we put months of work into coming up with innovative ways to stratify, which you didn't go over yesterday, and so we were actually fine. And that's really the answer. Okay. So just coming back to this, doing the baseline. Within Stata, I don't know R as much. I assume there's a similar command. There's a command where you say that you're doing several rounds of data. You're putting in baseline data, right? So you're controlling for your baseline level. And then it prompts you for another question, which is, what's the correlation over time between these variables? Right? So if putting in a baseline is going to soak up variation, it needs to know kind of how much it's soaking up. So so it's going to ask you, if you put in baseline data, how much you're changing, how much that then explains the next round of data. So just be aware, and again, that's something that if you're doing this, it can be quite hard. You've then got to find data in a similar sample that is not just one round, but is 2 rounds, so you can calculate how much height last year predicts height this year.
当当当，你哦，在这呢，搁这呢。谢谢浮生归风的神枪手，谢谢 My Danny 的神枪手，谢谢德味曾有的神枪手，谢谢摘星星给你的泥花筒，1、2、3、4、5、6。完了，今天没有队友。Hello， 你好，打吗
？Hello， 邓老板。
哎，好，不好意思，拜拜。你家还在？谢谢汤搞笑的欢乐女花筒，谢谢。谢谢雨的真爱主角是什么歌啊？不好听，我们换一首。谢谢小新的盐汽水的神枪手，谢谢。谢谢果子的星星，谢谢果子 ，Thank you。噔噔噔噔噔噔噔。2。Hello， 你好，打吗？
打。
啊？
你已进入1级战备状态，加油，特种兵！
哎，好像是有点手机号。完了，这待会走不掉了。谢谢南极的爱的纸鹤，我是不是得换个图了？谢谢小倩不是鬼666的掌上萌猪，谢谢小倩不是鬼，谢谢。打过就打过呗，没关系，没有一点关系。
飞机很快就要起飞了，
水杯呢？
各位特种兵，请准备。
谢龟欧的捏捏小脸，谢谢。谢切尔的比心兔兔，谢揪一个的520，谢揪一个。谢迪迦说南方很潮的神枪手，谢迪迦说南方很潮。谢谢谢陈小陈白池塘的神枪手，谢子万代的折鹤，谢不想失眠的神枪手。那我能跟你飞一下吗？我去拿个杯子，我有点渴。
好。
哎，好嘞。杯子在呢。谢美杜莎的神枪手，谢雪的小星辰的神枪手。哦，对哦，我有个问题，我一直说要问你们，你们老实跟我说，你们是不是给我微博卖粉了？哎，我那微博现在你知道有多少万不？我那抖音大号都没那么多人，你能想象不？我微博有18.4万，我抖音都没这么多关注啊。 怎么会这么夸张啊？我每天我就看那个人数往上蹭呐、我每天在想，我说是不是谁给我买粉了？哇，他人真的往上！我说我那个抖音那12万都没过，那微博的18.4万了，在网上我都20万了都。我一直想问来的。那欢迎思问，我觉得好家伙，我真不是也没啥呀。它会自动给我涨粉，哎，不是别的平台不都是给钱才会有吗？他怎么贴钱给呢？那他不是亏了吗？可不行啊！千万别让我知道你们花钱给我买这玩意儿，那我跟你说我心痛，心痛2023。清一下，不清了吧？带我清一下18.3万，清完只剩3.8万，不好，不清很好。哎，妹妹怎么不说话呀？妹妹咋不说话？
So estimating
Okay.
rho. This is our intra-cluster correlation.
老方法。
Rho has to be between 0 and 1. Remember, it's the proportion of variance. It's a
Okay.
proportion, so it has to be between 0 and 1. Really depends a lot on the
Well,
context and which
well,
outcome
well,
variable. You know, some outcome variables are
well,
can be very
well,
correlated
well,
within area, some aren't. Now, to estimate rho well, to estimate how much people are similar within groups, you need a lot of data. So that's why it can be a problem to get it from pilot data. And your power calculator is going to be very estimate rho.
啊？我不信这根邪了，你近点。是谁了？妹妹不信说话呀？我都懂，我都懂。家有人，不方便说话，不方便开麦。
你怎么不说话？
哦，没开麦。妹妹没懂。增火吧，增火吧，增火吧！有人，有人，有人！前面有人，小心哈！
好，
我是不是得躲着走啊？呀呀！这真人还是
啊，人机
？Sorry
要
啊，
6倍吗？
不帮你拿，你拿，你拿吧。
这有个人，
标记了一处地点。
没事没事，你打你打的。我刚没想抢。
你打你打我不打。
真小心。 算算算，
没什么。
没了，填报。
well to estimate how much people are
Damn it,
similar
damn it, damn
within groups. Estimate row well to estimate how much people are similar within groups. You need a lot of data. So that's why estimate row well to estimate how well area some aren't.
真好
Now
啊
to
肥了
estimate row well to estimate how much people are
要不要
similar
录呀
within groups.
我
You
有
need a
了，我
lot
有
of
了，妹
data.
妹，
So that's why it can be a problem to get it from pilot
刚
data.
给我了。
And your power calculators are going to be very sensitive to that number. So when I do power calculations, I estimate it, but then I also look at, well, what if my estimate of row is wrong? What if it's a little bit bigger? What if it's a little bit smaller? And I do a whole bunch of different calculations to see how sensitive my power and my sample size estimates are to different possible rows. So here's just some rows
你说啥？
from different studies we've done, just to show you how much it changes.
Oh.
So
我没有听
I was
清
doing a lot of
楚
work on agriculture, so
你说啥
there's quite a lot of agriculture in there.
我什么都
You
没
know,
说。
household production of maize, very low. Household production of cocoa, very high. Why? Because cocoa can only be grown in very specific
进去
climate areas. And so, you know, some parts of the country there's not going to be any, some parts of the country everyone's going to be growing cocoa.
怎么说？
Rice yields, for some reason, yields actually tend to be very different in different, you know, within the same community. You have good farmers and bad farmers.
那走吧。
This is quite interesting because test scores are all very different in different places. Like sometimes test scores are very correlated, sometimes they're not very correlated. So you really need to know.
我这边有个摩托过去了。
你这边有个摩托过去了，你在？好，马上过来啊。
他走了。
行，问题不大。
Very different in different places. Like sometimes test scores are very correlated, sometimes they're not very correlated. So you really need to know that from your context. You've got your Texas precinct voting preferences kind of in the middle.
狼也抽
Hospital
搐，
admissions, you know, people that's very
so
different,
true,
so very low
true,
intercluster
true.
correlation, as is weight and cholesterol.
这普通
With
话
again
越来越
another
绕
test
嘴
score,
了。
which is reasonably high. So this is just to say, like it really depends. There is no standard row. Like it really depends. And I think from my intuition, we can see that some things people are very similar within clusters, and some it really depends. What's the cluster? What's the thing?
我真的服了，你说什么？我真无语。不是，我真的好想把海龟发给我的话读给你们听哦。一点都受不住，真受不了。谢谢得未曾有的漏灯牌，谢谢各友的多喝热水，谢谢各友，谢谢这样的捏捏小脸，谢谢陆小叮当的万象烟花，谢谢陆小叮当，谢谢海龟，我能说吧？海龟，他说他让我进入桃花期，桃花开始了。我能服你的！谢谢陆小叮当的晚上烟花，谢谢月亮美
Treatment
和
arms.
南方躺在
Big
我怀
decision
里
that you have to make. Very big impact
因
on
为
power.
左边有人，哎呀，
The nice thing about having lots of treatment arms is that we can really disentangle mechanisms, so we don't just test the program. We see what if we do it this way, what if we do it that way. We look at the training that's driving the
我
results.
加个要打一个。
You know, you can really take it apart, take apart a complicated program, test the little bits on
我没有
their
太
own,
行，我觉
put
得
them all
他
together,
有点
see if there's
搞笑。
complementarity between different parts of the program, all sorts of like fascinating things. And you know, I see people get excited when they're designing these and they want to do 15 arms, and you can't do 15 arms because of power.
谢谢高小猴的神枪
Lots of
手，
arms requires lots of sample size.
他那贵在服人，
You also have to start thinking about
Okay,
different effect sizes
Do
that you
them,
want to
do
pick up. Because the effect size between
Yeah,
one treatment
well,
group
I
and a
think
control group may be different from what you want to pick up between treatment 1 and treatment 2. Especially if treatment 1 and treatment 2 are pretty similar, they're just slightly different, then you might need to pick up a
你要够吗？
slightly different effect size.
要够不够啊
So it's going to be different for
Yeah,
comparing
go.
treatment and control versus comparing treatment 1 versus treatment 2.
？OK，我有，
I'm not going to delve
Okay,
into
never.
an example to
我
look
还蛮
at
多的。
how do we think about
Tell
multiple
about.
treatment arms and how that compares.
吧。
So have to start thinking
Okay,
about
okay.
different. The program we see. What if you did it this way? What if you did it
師傅啊。
that way? Is it
你唔
treatment
過
arms? Big decision that you have to
嗯
make. Very big impact on
唔得
power. The nice thing about having lots of treatment arms is that we can really disentangle mechanisms, so we don't just test the program, we see what if you did it this way, what if you did it that way, is it the cache, is it the training that's driving the result? You know, you can really take apart a complicated program, test the little bits on their own, put them all together, see if there's complementarity between different parts of the program, all sorts of like fascinating things. And you know, I see people get excited when they're designing these and they want to do 15 arms, and you can't do 15 arms because of power. So lots of arms requires lots of sample size. You also have to start thinking about different effect sizes that you want to pick up. Because the effect size between one treatment group and the control group may be different from what you want to pick up between treatment 1 and treatment 2. Especially if treatment 1 and treatment 2 are pretty similar, they're just slightly different, then you might need to pick up a slightly different effect size. Right? So it's going to be different for comparing treatment and control versus treatment 1 versus treatment 2. Okay. And I'm going to delve into an example to look at how do we think about multiple treatment arms and how that compares how we think about the effect size. This is a project I have been working on for 9 years in Bangladesh, and it is looking at child marriage. This is the kind of needs assessment. So this is from national level data, and you get the percentage of girls completing secondary school, 9% in 2007, 19% in 2011. The percent of girls who were married before the age of 18, 66%, 65%, no real decline. So the majority of girls are getting married while they're still kids. They're giving birth as teenagers. In our population, a third of the girls are stunted, so you've got to think of like a 15-year-old body of a 12-year-old giving birth. Not a good idea. Very low levels of contraception use and very high levels of giving birth at home. So very low utilization of health facilities. And in general, a picture of a need for, I would say, women's empowerment. So we were working with Save the Children to look at programs to address those issues, and this is what we came up with. One is an empowerment program where girls are work in safe spaces after school. So about 3 to 5 times a week they're meeting after school, usually in a friend's house, 20 of them, and they're going through a program. They look at where they taught about gender attitudes, literacy, health information, sort of livelihood skills, and they go through that curriculum for 6 months. That's the basic treatment. Kishri Konta is the name of the program. Some then got a livelihoods program where they taught basically financial literacy with the idea that if you improve negotiation skills, but here is, if you can be more economically active and valuable to your parents, maybe that is a way to impairment. Maybe that is the way, your parents may value you more. Maybe have a little bit of money to help you stay at school, etc. And half of this group received saving clubs as well, where they were encouraged to save. A very different approach was to give a financial incentive to the parents to delay the marriage. So this is a setting in which parents have to pay a dowry when their girl gets married. The dowry rises with age. So if you marry your girl, if you delay the marriage of your daughter, it comes at a big financial cost to you. So this incentive was designed to offset that financial cost to the parents. It was given because Save the Children didn't want to hand out cash. It was given in the form of cooking oil, which is just something that everyone has to buy, and therefore you get it for free, and therefore it's sort of equivalent to cash. And the full group are the group that gets this basic training, financial literacy, and the financial incentive. So this is kind of throw everything at it group. And then we have the control group. And these are the number of communities that were randomized. So 76 communities get this, 77 get financial literacy, and we end up with 400. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 treatment groups and a control group. And then we did a crosscut, which is we take half of this group and half of this group and add an additional treatment, which is the saving clubs. It doesn't actually use up any more sample size. But it comes at a certain cost, but I'll just explain. Let me explain. What are the hypotheses we're testing with this many treatments? And then for each hypothesis, we have to calculate for each different comparison. So the first one is, does the basic program have any effect on our outcomes, our age of marriage and staying in education? Those are our basic main outcomes. For that, we compare the treatment 1 to the control group. Okay? Notice I have an unequal allocation. Right? I've got 153. We'll see why in a minute. So I do one power calculation for that. The next thing I want to do is what's the marginal impact of adding financial literacy to the program?
交给你了。
For that, I'm going to compare treatment 1 and treatment 2.
是啊，
So the effect size I'm going to try and pick up is just the
这否啊？
marginal impact of those two.
勒斗啊，
Right? And now I've got less power because I
Ladle,
don't have
ladle.
this nice big control group. I'm comparing 76 to 77 groups. So, you know, once you start doing these multiple treatment groups, you've got to do the power thing for all these different hypotheses. Now, some of them are going to be the same.
这否啊？
Every time I compare 76 to 77, it's going to be the same, right? But they are going to be different.
不是，我们刚刚
Now,
今年有
the
一个
other
人
thing
讲
that I can do, and this is why I have the bigger control group, is that I can ask a question of if I combine these two and just say, did KK work? If there's two different versions of KK, I'm just going to combine them into one group and say, did it work? And when I say it, I mean half of them getting financial literacy and half of them not, but you know, overall, did it work? And we're doing the analysis now, and for most outcomes, not all, but for most outcomes, we're getting a 0 here. We're getting a very precise 0 because we're getting 153 versus 153. So when I'm thinking about my treatment arms, I'm thinking about can I pool them and get a really precise number from a pooled
OK， 你
comparison.
去找他，没关系，待会儿我会看到你的亡灵，不要紧，
And similarly,
加油，加油
we
特工
find that these two groups delay marriage. The financial incentive is effective in delaying marriage, but you know, when we're designing it,
今天到底谁
hypothesizing
把谁
if that
置于
happens,
死地？
well, if we want to look at the effect of delayed
我知
marriage
待会儿
on
怎么走啊？
things, again, we have a nice fact sample to look at because we're comparing
妹妹好，
154 to
妹妹，来来来。
153. Right? So there are
不用
some
管我的
things
死活。
I can answer the question much more precisely.
好嘞，
than
妹妹，
others, and I
太
think
棒
that's
太棒。
important when we're doing those complicated designs.
没关系，
Now
我
then, my
可以，我能
savings
过。
design,
你这
I'm going to take
做
half of this and half of that
我掩护你。
and compare it to the other half and the other half, and that's going to give the marginal impact of savings clubs.
OK，
Given
打
all
个
the
仗
rest that
不
else is going on, and I can't in
打
any
草
way, I'm
我打
never going to be, it never
下
was
次
my
就打
intention
草
of being able to compare, you know, this versus this versus that. That's going to be too small. So I'm making a decision at the beginning. There's
我
some
太棒了，
individual
Nickel
cells
diamond
in there I'm not going to be able to
Jingle.
distinguish. I'm only going to be able to pool those in
Jingle
savings
baby.
and those without savings, and that's what a crosscut
我是打死五
design
枪了。
does. Crosscut is where you know, you're not worried about the individual cells. You're just, you know, you're taking half of everything and comparing them, but you won't be able to do it.
但
So
是你
these are
先
all
骗别人
trade-offs that
像
you have to
我，
think
你
about.
我
What's
不
the
知
question
道
I
我
want to answer? What question do I
好吧
want to answer
这否
precisely?
啊，打的给
And
我，
power
加油啊！
is we aim for 80% power. But we may sometimes want to throw in a question knowing that we're not going to have much power. But hey, a 50% chance of being able to answer it is kind of useful. I wouldn't design a whole RCT around that. But there may be cases where I'm willing, you know, if I'm going to answer a whole bunch of questions, I may just throw in a question that I know from the beginning I only have 50% power, a 50% chance of answering.
是不给他人头。
So, what are some practical tips from having done this
我
many
们都不
times?
挣扎一会儿的吗？万
You
一
really want to have at least one intensive arm.
好犀利
What
啊
I！mean by an intensive arm is one
冇
where
問
a zero
冇
would
問
be
題
interesting.
好犀利，
I have done lots of RCTs and got lots of
好犀
zeros.
利。
And sometimes the zero is interesting, and sometimes people say, well, if we'd done it, it would have worked. Well, it was only this long. Well, you know, that's really, then you get a zero, and it's not very interesting. You have to always think when you're designing these things, there is a
我
chance
现
I'm
在
going to
讲
get a
完就
zero.
麻掉了，我就做一
And if
下
I get a
那
zero,
个
is it going to be interesting
体
enough?
操
Now, what does that
我就不
mean?
行
The program was had a sufficiently high, you know, people
我
thought
真
it
的
was going to
讲完
work,
了，我就做一下
or
体
enough
操。
people are doing it already
这
that it's
样
interesting that it doesn't work. And the other part of being a zero being interesting
不
is
是
it has to be
不是
precise enough.
监控，我现在说的
Because
是
if you
真
can,
的。
if all you're doing is saying I can't distinguish this from zero, but it could have had an effect, but I couldn't have found a big effect. You know, it could have had an effect, but I couldn't pick it up. Can't distinguish it from zero, but there's a massive standard error around it. That's really not interesting. The only thing that's interesting is a precise zero. You can rule out that this had even a marginal effect. That is interesting. If you can say, well, I can't distinguish it from zero, but it could have been big, it could have been negative, I don't really know, you shouldn't have done the trial. In the analysis, they've said it may be useful to pool some arms. So think about that when you're doing the design, what would be an interesting pool, and that pool will be measured very precisely. And often we pool any treatment. The different treatment, there might be slightly different varieties of treatment, but you know, think about creating an any treatment arm. And often we
我
pool
告诉你，我是真的，我去做一下那个体操，我蹦两下，
any
我
treatment.
真的很麻。
A different treatment, there might be slightly different varieties of treatment, but you know, think about creating an any treatment arm.
等我一下，我是真的麻了，我真的麻了，我不是很骗妹妹的。
So another trick, another tip, is you have to think about what the sample size is giving you in the different statistical packages,
等会儿我
right?
蹦两下啊。
Because if you've got multiple treatment arms, and the statistical package may not know that you're doing multiple treatment arms. So what do I mean? Stata gives you the sample per cell. It assumes that you're doing treatment and control, but then it says, this is how much you'll need for treatment, this is how much you'll need for control. Well then, if you've got 3 treatments, you have to multiply by the number of treatment arms you've got, right? So, you know, when we use the term cell, we mean the number of treatments plus control. So something that has 2 treatment arms and 1 control has 3 cells. So if you put it into Stata and Stata says 90, you know, it says 100, that they're meaning 100 treatment, and 100 control, and 100 for the other treatment, right? So it's 300. So just the different packages will present it in different ways, but just be aware of that. So optimal design, as I say, I think it assumes one treatment, one control, and they will just give you the overall sample size. And so you have to divide it by 2, and that gives you the number per cell. So Stata and optimal design do it slightly differently, so just be really aware of what it is that you're getting. And given that, as I say, apologies, R is not, I haven't used R very much.
不是我真的吗？我刚才把那个腿盘在屁股底下做的，然后我打完之后我就麻掉了，我整个脚麻到不行。那怎么办嘛？这不是可能最近锻炼有点，不是锻炼，最近可能那个有点走路有点多嘛。你要理解，你知道不？这7号的爱的祝贺，谢谢。我跟你说，我到现在都麻的。谢妮妮的漏灯牌，以及一口小白的神枪手，谢尼古拉斯翠花带的守护，我还是有点麻。谢谢瑞的兄的义乌商城批发小市场啊！我本来今天准备去按摩的，没按摩成，用扳我脚的大拇指，扳我的脚的大拇指，我。一个青春美少女啊，搁这边直播啊，上面在打游戏，下面在扳脚大拇指啊，你要不要自己想看这个场景？我不，我要形象的好不好？哎，你说他为什么会麻？为什么右边不麻，只有左边麻呢？我才不正骨呢！我以前跟朋友去按摩，哇，那个按摩师把他都反着拉伸，我看着都怕人。谢谢小赖哥的花开烂漫，谢谢小赖哥，谢谢，谢谢 ZGG 带来的祝贺，谢谢 ZGG， 谢谢 K 的万象烟花，谢谢 K， 谢谢，谢谢 K。当当当当当当当当当当！谢谢谁不喜欢衬衫呀的棒棒糖，谢谢，谢谢 Rain 仔仔的漏灯牌，谢谢，谢谢刘样的棒棒糖，谢谢刘样。哎，我的牌搭子们真的不，牌搭子 ，OK， 我被我的牌搭子放弃了。咱们去找一下刺花上也可以。谢谢嗨亚的神枪手，谢谢小欢的薰衣草庄园。
I promised you that there would be cases where unequal allocation, where it might be the right thing to do an unequal allocation. I promised you that there would be cases where unequal allocation, where it might be the right thing to do an unequal allocation ratio. So you just saw an example in my Bangladesh study, where you're going to pool it, and therefore unpooled it's going to be unequal, but pooled it's going to be equal. The other important case is when you have a certain amount of money, and that amount of money is going to be spent on both the implementation and the evaluation. Now, why do we want an unequal allocation ratio then? Because adding one person to treatment is going to be much more expensive than adding one person to control. Because when I add someone to treatment, I have to pay for the treatment and the survey. Because
你是女孩子吗？
adding one person to treatment is going to the other important case is when you have a certain amount of money, and that amount of money is going to be spent on both the implementation and the evaluation. Now, why do we want an unequal allocation ratio then? Because adding one person to treatment is going to be much more expensive than adding one person to control. Because when I add someone to treatment, I have to pay for the treatment and the survey. And if you're talking about admin data, which you often use in the US, adding someone to the control may cost like nothing. So then why not put a whole ton of people in control? Like it'll increase your precision a bit and it doesn't cost you anything. Whereas adding someone to the treatment, it may be a very expensive treatment. That's going to really cost you a hell of a lot. So it may make sense. So the reason that we normally go for 50-50 is one more person in treatment, one person in control gives you equal amount of extra power. But that's assuming that it costs the same to add one person to treatment and one person to control. If it costs you, 5 times as much to add someone to treatment, you're almost certainly going to get more power after adding 5 people to control than one person to treatment. Right? So you could figure out a formula that would tell you, what's the cost of adding it, and some of our affiliates have done that. But what I do is I just try different treatment, try different allocation ratios, and sort of you'll see that
Hello?
basically initially
Hey,
you'll
hi.
get it'll be fine. You know, adding a few more people, you don't lose much from being slightly unequal, and then you lose a lot when you're really unequal. So, you know, just try it with different treatment allocations, and you get pretty quickly get a sense of where you're really getting diminishing benefit from adding more and more people safe to control. And there's really not much benefit. And you can just try out the budget of doing different allocations and power, and try and get a sense of what's the right optimal allocation. The other thing, the other tip, is to put your money behind your most important question, right? So when you've got multiple treatments, put more sample in the question that you care most about. Again, you know, pooling treatments. If you're going to pool treatments, then make sure you have a nice big control. And if you really care, if the main point of your analysis, the main point of doing this is to compare the difference between treatment 1 and treatment 2, then you don't want it all in control. You want to put it in the treatment groups, because if, you know, the key issue is comparing treatment 1 and treatment 2, then you need treatment 1 and treatment 2 to be big, because control isn't coming into that decision, into that. So it's all about where you know, what's your most important question. So yeah, we talked about that as an unequal allocation. And in the end, it turned out, you know, we didn't have a huge amount of sample to compare between this treatment and that treatment. I mean, this is a massive sample project. Overall, we've got 11,000 girls in detail and many more that we get some data from. But in the end, these two have zero effect, so I'm not really interested in whether one's bigger than the other, because they're both zero. Okay, so now we get some data from. But in the end, these two have zero effect, so I'm not really interested in whether one's bigger than the other. Overall, we've got 11,000 girls in detail and many more that we get some data from. But in the end, these two have zero effect, so I'm not really interested in whether one's bigger than the other. Okay, so now we're going to go in detail on minimum detectable effect size. So I'm just going to get your sense at the beginning, before we start it, your views. What effect size should you use when designing your experiment? When you're doing the power calculations for designing your experiment, what effect size should you put into that equation? The smallest effect size that could still be cost effective, the largest effect size you expect your program to produce, both.
我来了。
他我对面还有一个好像，真的有。
他们那补。
嗯。
你等会儿。OK， 到我出马的时候了。我4、5天未打，这一战我要赢得漂亮。我南方重回巅峰，巅峰之战。
Is particularly important. Let me explain why. What is this minimum detectable? So I'm going to argue that it's the smallest effect size that can still be cost effective is particularly important. Let me explain why. What is this minimum detectable effect size? I've been talking about it all the way through, but this is really a, you know.
他是个男的，我还开全部麦了。
他骂你了？
他骂我好菜。
他骂你了？
骂我了。
听不了一点。他骂你了是吧？要不骂就骂了吧，找不到你。
我不要。
找不到他呀，关键是。好了，我就听你帮我瞅。
The critical design question. It actually, like if you look at the formula, it has the biggest effect on the sample size when you're calculating your power. Like everything else was a square root and this wasn't. So it has a really big effect. It's not the effect that we want or expect. That is not what you want to plug in. Right? And that everyone does this. It's wrong. That is not what the minimum detectable effect is. It's a minimum detectable effect size. It's not what you hope the program's going to achieve. It's the effect size. Think back to what we were doing with those curves. It's the effect size below which you will not be able to distinguish the effect from zero. Or with 80%, right? Even if it exists. So what does that mean for what it should be? I.e., it's the effect size below which it might as well be zero. And that is a policy question. It's not a statistics question.
他真跑了。
Right? How big does this program have to be?
他不会这么怂吧？他会抓人机，
这好像就是人机啊。
To actually mean something. Because that's what I want to be able to pick up. If it's smaller than that, it might as well be 0. That's what we're saying. We're saying we don't want to pick it up if it's smaller than that, because it doesn't really matter. Right? Because if it's below that, you may have a high probability of saying, I can't distinguish, it's not statistically significant, and people, they shouldn't, but people are likely to respond saying it didn't work. Okay? Statistically, what we're saying is we can't distinguish it from 0, but that'll go out there and people will say, well, it's not significant, this program isn't significant. So you don't want that to happen unless the effect is so small that it kind of might as well be 0. So the kinds of questions you need to ask yourself when you're setting the MDE is, below what effect size would the program not be cost effective? Because if it's smaller than that, it might as well be 0. Like if it's not going to be cost effective, if it's that small, then it might as well be 0. How big an effect would you need to make the result interesting? Again, like if you give people, you know, a huge amount of money and it doesn't have any effect, that's kind of interesting. So, you know, how big an effect would it need to be to make the result interesting? You may want a smaller MDE between treatment arms than between treatment and control. Again, if you really care about distinguishing this version of the program than that version of a program, well, how big a difference would you need for that to be relevant? That may be smaller than the question of whether it overall has an effect. Right? If a slight tweak to the program could have quite a small effect and still be worth it, because it's not costing you very much more to do it slightly differently. So that would suggest a very small MDE between treatment arms. As I've said, you know, that comes with lots of costs, but again, that's what you've got to ask yourself. So a common mistake is when doing a power calculation is simply to look at the MDE between treatment and control and not think about what's the relevant MDE between treatment groups. And I see that control and not think about calculation is simply to look at the MDE between treatment and control and not think about what's the relevant MDE between treatment groups. And I see that all the time. Okay, so we think of, you know, power equations. Again, this is what you get in the statistics books. You do the equation, you do it once, there's one thing. Well, that's not actually how it works. Often, we've got many outcomes that we care about. So then you need to do the power analysis for all the different outcomes that you care about. So this is what my power table looks like in my application for funding for that Bangladesh study. It's a little complicated. It's not one number. Right? So what have we got? We've got all the different outcomes I'm going to measure, and they all have different power. There's no point in putting the sample size there. Like the thing that you want to put is the minimum detectable effect size, because the sample size, you said, this is my sample size, and someone has to judge whether it's worth funding the study. So what do we put? We put the minimum detectable effect size. How big an effect will I be able to pick up? Is this precise enough to make the study interesting? So I have the other thing you remember, sometimes I'm comparing 77 to 77, and sometimes I'm comparing 154 to 154, depending on the question. So I've got two versions for the questions where I'm doing one treatment versus another, and the ones where I'm pooling. Right? So I've got two different MDEs for each outcome. And then I'm just giving you the ICC and the standard deviation for that variable. So again, the ICC is going to be different for every different variable that I'm using as an outcome measure. So I have to do this differently for each variable. Okay? Yeah.
So I guess for continuous data points, we're in sort of absolute numbers. But what if it's sort of a binary that's pass fail sort of? Are we looking at sort of past percentages at that point? I mean, sort of how does that translate?
Yeah. So you just do you know, the outcome is, say, the percentage, or in a sense, it's the probability that you would, you know, say we're doing, have I got, no, so I could do whether married by 18, right? And then it would be, then I'd look at the data of the percentage of people who are married, but in a sense, if you think about it at the individual level, it's what's the probability that she would be married before 18. So actually, where you can, it's better to translate it into a continuous variable. It's the kind of funny things that sometimes happen at the ends of the distribution on a binary. And you have a little bit more power sometimes, where you have a continuous. So I prefer to do it on age of marriage rather than child marriage. But you know, in the end, in the analysis paper we're writing, we show both. So you know, these are the different variables, and I've got it, as I say, for the different. They're all measured. I prefer to do my power equations for the actual outcome, not in standard deviations, because I think it's very hard to think about that. You know, when you plug it in, you do a standardized effect size. But when you show it and you think about it, think about the actual underlying variable here, right? Because we have a better intuition of what's a big enough effect to make sense when we think about the actual underlying variable. So in this case, age at marriage, we can pick up 0.09 of a year. Well, that's pretty small, right? But if I put it in standard deviations, you wouldn't know what that meant at all. Number of births, number of kids, we can pick up 0.1 of a. Well, that's pretty small, right? It makes sense when we think about the actual underlying variable. So in this case, age at marriage, we can pick up 0.09 of a year. Well, that's pretty small, right? But if I put it in standard deviations, you wouldn't know what that meant at all. Number of births, number of kids, we can pick up 0.1 of a kid difference, right? That you know whether that's big or small. You have some intuition of whether that's big or small. Put it in standard deviations, it's much harder to think about it, I think. So as I say, and then this is, we're talking about 0.09 impact on the average of 18 years. So, that's a pretty precise estimate that we're going to be able to get. Now, that's not true of everything.
等会儿，
Like, we're not going to actually be, we don't have anything like as much power for the number of antenatal visits. I'm still going to measure it, because I'm doing all this work, I might as well measure it. But I know going in that, it's 0.18 on a mean of 3, that's not as good. But it's not my main outcome variable. I'm still going to do a power analysis of it, but it's not my main outcome variable.
我也担心。
Okay, so
啊，那你真惨。
which statement is not correct? And I'll have to think
我可不是。
very hard to make sure
我
I
刚
get this
刚
right.
见完女朋友。
In general, cheaper programs
不是，
can be
我刚
tested
见完对
with
象
smaller
回来。
sample sizes.
有雷吗？
When calculating MDE, we need to think about likely take-up rates. A smaller MDE means the effect will be estimated more precisely, all else equal.
你有女朋友啊？
MDE has a big influence on
啊，
power
你刚听到什
for a
么？
given sample size.
没有啊，
我听你说有女朋友。
我说对象，就没有办法，就对象他挺那个的，唉，就是隔得有点远啊。粘人。
粘人是吧？隔得有点远啊。
对对，隔着有点远，就是可能得跨个境啊，过个区啊，
那这种对象
才能去看到他。
不能要了呀！你看看我呗，这种对象真不能要。我跟你讲，这么远，不像我，你看一触摸就能到，你看对吧？
你是泡泡，你是空气，一触摸你就能碰到。哇，心在跳，
心在跳，爱情如烈火。
了，有点东西。
这个掉了，我都会啦。哎呀，
我刚那个，你刚听到我手机铃声了没？那歌熟不熟悉啊？
没有啊。
没有啊。
没有，你再放一遍。
等会儿我用这个手机打那个手机的号啊，你再听一遍啊。
我知道你在骗我。
哇，你哭的声音真的好像我哇，还有抽泣感，还有那个哇的空气的那个阻液感跟那个抽搐的那种哇，那个情感你到达的非常饱满呢。
真的吗？来，给你一个。
我这儿有好东西哦，快来！
啊，不要。
我给你东西你都不要了，现在。
你给的东西我
你是有的吗？
有。
你是有的吗？那你把你那个扔掉，拿我的那个呗。
有真人妹妹。
哇好 ，OK。
有个人开小毛女怪了。不是这个。那边那个房间有人开毛女怪了。别揍我。
爸，亏。
因为你是
姐姐。
哎，你再撑会好不好？直接换个子弹。哎，好嘞。心在跳，热情如烈火。
Okay.
哎呀
that's not correct.
为什么
In general,
快呀？
cheaper programs, we're going to want a smaller MDE because it's more interesting. Even if they have a small effect, that can be a pretty good effect because you're not spending much money. So you need to be able to pick up a small effect. So you need a big sample size. So it's kind of funny that you need an expensive evaluation to evaluate a cheap program, but that's the way it is. Because, you know, if a deworming pill costs 10 cents, you know, it can be incredibly powerful and important, even if it has a tiny effect. So you're going to need a big sample to pick up the tiny effect. If you're going to throw millions of dollars at a village, you don't need very many villages, because if you have a small effect, I don't care. I really don't care if you have a small effect, if you throw, you know, $5 million at it, at one village. Like, I just... So the small programs are going to be harder to evaluate, because you need to be precise to find their, to pick up a small effect. I mean, maybe they end up having a big effect, that's fine, but you need to be able to pick up a small effect if the true effect is small. So again, it's not about what you expect, it's not about what people have found in the past, it's about how small an impact you want to be able to distinguish from zero. So I'm just very quickly going to go over how you do this in this different statistical packages, and this is going to change as packages change, so always, you know, keep your eyes open for changes as you do these things. Stata has a new command, power, which I am very disappointed about, because the nice thing about it is you can do it different ways, you can state sample size and get out power. The problem is it doesn't allow for clustering. So for me, I kind of never can use it. So most people use the old versions of the old commands that we use to look at this issue, which is sampsci and sampclass. Those are add-ons to Stata, and cluster sampsci. The default in those programs is that power is 90 and significance is 5%. If you want to change that, you can. If you don't say anything, it will just give you those. So, you know, what do you do? I mean, you'll go over this with your TAs, but what do you do if you want to detect an increase in the average test scores from 43 to 45%? And that was our original example, with a power of 80%, you would write sampsci, and this is the, you know, average in the control, average in the treatment. You want to be able to pick up, so your MDE is the difference between those two. Power 0.8, that's the... SD is the standard deviation, right?
You need to specify standard deviation. And you can do SE1 or SE2 depending on whether you're...
这个错你答上来了，这个雷我字了。
Stata gives, to actually do the coding, Stata gives n per cell, as we've talked about before, the sample size per cell. So it will say n1 is 99. With multiple arms, again, as I said before, we need to multiply by the number of cells, the number of treatments plus control. And for binary outcomes, your standard deviation is going to be determined by... Oh yes, that was why I was being confused by this, because I was thinking that was the 5 was the significance, and that's not the significance. But remember, the significance is 5% by default, so I don't need it. Okay, I do specify power as 0.8 because their power is 90, and I don't want that default. I want 80. Power in Stata with clustering. You first calculate the sample size without clustering, and then you do an add-on. So in the above experiment, if you were to randomize at class level with 60 per class and an ICC of 0.2, you do exactly the same thing that you just did. Right, assume it's an individual, and then you'd add sampclass. You do another command for sampclass, telling them about what the clustering is, the observations per cluster, and the row. And in optimal design, this is a special software that's designed for doing power calculations. MDE must be entered in a standardized effect size. So remember, the 43 and the 45, those were the test scores. They were not standardized. This, you have to put it in standardized. And the nice thing about OD, the reason I use OD is it allows clustering at multiple levels. So I sometimes have 3 levels of clustering. I did constituency level and polling center level, and then individual. So I had data at all 3 levels, and Stata can't cope with that, but OD can.
那你答应我，能保护好自己吗？姐姐自累累了。
And standardized. And the nice thing about OD, the reason I use OD is it.
这样吧，咱们不如直接跳基地，你死我也死，咱俩死的均衡一点。
跳哪里啊？
咱们直接跳基地，你嘎我也嘎，咱们嘎的均匀一点，就不用你等我，我等你，咱们一起嘎吧。反正都急着下一把。
没事。都行，我很强。
妹妹有的时候是不是说一点谎言可以增加自己的信心啊？
我让你善良一点，可以吗？
好呢，
这位小姐姐，好呢。你夸一下我，我可能会有更多理由。
对，你好棒哦！
那你叫我一声姐姐吧，让我比较有活力一点，好吧？
大晚上做梦了。
我的，我命
现在几点？
还能打下那个基地哦，保护你哦。
真的，哇塞，妹妹你啊，你要不听看你在说什么？
啊，我在说啊，我可以。
是你可以。
Correct.
I can fly.
Making the standard error half the size.
You
Good.
can bye bye bye.
All right, so now we're done with the theory
你
of
这个
sampling.
太早。
来抓紧吧。
At this point, I
反正
think we'll talk a
赶
little
时
bit.
间。
Actually, I know because I have the slides in front of me. We'll talk a little bit about the
我
how
觉得他们
we
都
do
不是我
sampling
们
in the
两个
field.
对手。
不是你对手，不是你对手，没事，我还是有点谦虚的。
你咋不跳基地呢？
有没有可能有一种，你什么时候跟我飞的？没关系，我们跳回去。
啊，
So this is hopefully, if you didn't find the last part
要
fun,
要
you're going to find this. Just
女孩
so
子
much
不
more
可以
exciting.
说不要。
All right, but
女孩子
before I
想要的
start,
东
I'd like
西
to
要
review
凭
some
自己
concepts
的
that we
努
went over
力
earlier in the
得
course
到。
with Joe.
人终归要有梦想，对不
Random
对？
selection, the concept of random
来跟
selection.
我说
So，
我可以啊。
let's say that this is our
说我可以啊。
population, this is the city in which we're working in.
说我可以啊。
我可以。
听懂掌声。
We look at the average, say we're able to measure all of everyone in the city, and we can see that the average income is about 1,200 rupees per month.
人活着为什么？就为了
Now, if we were to take a
听
random
懂掌
sample
声。
from that, we would expect,
Okay,
what would we
准备好了。
expect the average income of that random sample to be? So if this is the population, what would we expect the average of the random sample to be?
OK，没有，对你没什么别的要求，活着
The same.
两个
Exactly.
字，活着。
So plus or minus a little bit. Plus or minus maybe the standard error, 2 times the
太
same.
大声呢？
So that's one thing that we do when we are
的推面呢？我们要
that we often do when we're conducting an experiment is that we have our population,
此
but
时不
we
同，更待何时？
distill our population down into a study population. Sometimes we'll take a random sample in order to determine
亮，特别不错。
which
我是补的。
clusters we'll be working in.
好
And if we take a random sample, then we can say that our results are externally valid to the entire
过来
population.
了，过来了，
Oftentimes we
过
won't
来
take
过来，
a
忙的。
random sample, but either way we have to identify these hexagons, right? And then if these hexagons are little, like say each of these is a neighborhood,
你后面走吗？
we usually don't go in and sample the entire neighborhood. You know, ask them
打这边打着
long
呢，
consumption,
这
give
么
them
顺带
long
的事
consumption
情吗？
surveys of 3 hours or 4 hours long to figure out what their
我没事，
their
你
monthly
这人
per
他
capita
刚
income
我
is. Instead, we usually take a random sample from those.
OK，准备好，来，走，人要勇敢踏出第一步。
你说。
往往在前面的都是领头羊，
你
往往他肩负着队伍的最大责任。来，听懂掌声。上。
听了，怎么说？
走，走啊，
我上，我一个幼女子。
走啊，往前。
你给我等着，我跟你讲啊。
你要相信我在你后面誓死保护你。你有我这个队友，你放心。
有点紧张。哪个队友？
你绝对不会受一点伤。
OK。我看到人了，我们要打吗？
妹妹上来，come on，过来，他没子弹。
去哪里？
来，发了。
你在哪里？
我在仓库，快，一人一边，你走我要。Go，快来，他们真特别散，但他们刚刚没有枪没有药的，快！来，你走我右，你走我右。
我左右在哪？
你右我左。准备好了吗？你打这边，我打这边。是不是？
为什么我一个头都没有啊？
你要相信我。
炮灰啊！
你要相信我。
So, when we are identifying the sampling frame for our study, there are several things that we need to consider. First is what is the study area. So in this case, it is the city. We've decided that we're going to work in the city. Second thing, how do we identify the cluster? If we're doing a cluster randomized evaluation, how do we define the neighborhoods? Identify the neighborhoods in which we'll be collecting data. Right? So one typical way that we identify clusters is geographically, right? And so in this case, I was using the example of neighborhoods. Each of these hexagons represents a neighborhood. Now, typically, neighborhoods do not all come in the shape of cities. We actually need to identify the borders that in some way roughly reflects what that neighborhood is. So sometimes those borders are political administrative boundaries.
刚才那边有人的，这是一个队。
哪呢？ 哪边？刚刚在哪边看到你？感觉你很。
我很帅。
So like say that this is the
刚刚
school district for the school, or say that this is the everyone in this area has to vote at this polling booth as an example. A lot of times these neighborhoods are drawn for us by governments. Sometimes they're based on natural or physical boundaries, so maybe there's roads or rivers that give us the shape of these things. Sometimes they're a little bit more nebulous, like catchment areas. So if I was a bank and I was placed here, I may say that everyone within a 1 kilometer radius of my bank branch is in my catchment area, but maybe if this is a main road and it's really convenient for these guys to come, maybe I'll extend that a little bit. So my catchment area might be a little bit bigger. Or if I'm working at a clinic, say then maybe I've been assigned responsibility to this catchment area, and someone else has been assigned to the neighboring catchment area. They can be markets, even more nebulous. So as an example of a market is say in many rural areas, there's often kind of a village center or a town where everyone goes to sell their vegetables, to buy and sell basic groceries. So the catchment area of that market might be just every village that happens to go to that market as opposed to maybe the other market. But could be defined by markets. Could be defined by buildings. Sometimes our cluster is a school. That's a very obvious one. However, sometimes, and we had this in one of our projects recently, the school is not the same thing as a school. Sometimes in the Balsaki study, one school building typically hosted two separate schools. One school was in the morning, one school was in the afternoon. Right? And so one of the things that you may want to think about is that school, is each of those schools, and they each have different principals, different sets of teachers, different kids. Is each of those the cluster, or do we want to have the whole building be the cluster? So if our intervention is, for example, providing computers to the school building, chances are they're not going to pack up the computers every afternoon before the afternoon session comes in, right? Or if we're going to be painting the building or providing the trees, maybe it's the school building. Hospitals are typical cluster voting booths, as I was saying. Sometimes if we're doing finance or entrepreneurship related studies or studies with enterprises, maybe factories could be our cluster. Interestingly, sometimes time periods could be our cluster. So one example was like a morning school could be one cluster, the afternoon another. But probably a more appropriate example is, say we were offering job training to people, and every week we have a job training session. And every week, on Monday we start, Friday we end, and then next Monday it's a whole new crop of job trainees. Right? In theory, every week we could randomize differently. So a single job center could be, in a sense, job trainees in a session. And it was like a morning school, prizes, maybe factories could.
你成功吸引在哪？人在我的面前，你吸引在哪？你吸引他屁股后面尾气。
我从这里，你看我的眼睛，你看我从这里，然后滑到这边。 一不小心滑到这里，然后滑下来了。
妹妹有没有可能他跟我正四目相对？你在那边，你吸引他什么？你吸引他，你把他屁股后面的空气给他压缩。
你没看到我长得漂亮吗？
漂亮。
我这也不想要了。
太漂亮了。
来。
要不你洗睡吧，这个游戏好像不太适合你，它好像不太适合你，你说呢？
你就是把刚开始的时候说你生我生你死你也死，然后我们就来吧。
Be our cluster. Interestingly, sometimes time periods could be our cluster. So one example was like a morning school could be. Interestingly, sometimes time periods could be our cluster. So one example was like a morning school could be one cluster, the afternoon another. It was like a morning school.
可是你太漂亮了，你吸引到人了。你觉得每次长那么好看干什么？
快不给你复盘吗？你自己说要复盘，我就。
Prizes, maybe factories could be our cluster. Interestingly, sometimes time periods could be our cluster. So one example was like a morning school could be one cluster, the afternoon another. But probably a more appropriate example is, say we were offering job training to people, and every week we have a job training session. And every week, on Monday we start, Friday we end, and then next Monday it's a whole new crop of job trainees, right? In theory, every week we could randomize differently. So a single job center could be, in a sense, the location of randomization, but the cluster is actually that location times So every week is a different treatment arm. So that's one of the things we have to think about when we're defining our cluster. We also, so that's one of the things we have to think about when we're defining, but the cluster is actually that location times could be, in a sense, the location of randomization, but the cluster is actually that location times week. So every week is a different treatment arm. We end, and then next Monday it's a whole new crop of job trainees, right? In theory, every week we could randomize differently. So a single job center could have, could be, in a sense, the location of randomization, but the cluster is actually that location times week. So every week is a different treatment arm. So that's one of the things we have to think about when we're defining our cluster.
你说什么？你在说什么？你要不要听听看你在说什么？我会说中华人民，我们作为新生代带红领巾的小孩子，你在说什么脏话？呸！妹妹。
And how do we get those kids? How do we get that list of households? Sometimes our partner has access to those lists. Sometimes they're public. Like, for example, voter rolls are often public. Maybe it's not public who you voted for, but it's public that you're registered to vote, so you can often get those lists. Sometimes you can get access to official censuses. More often than not, you'll have to conduct your own census.
没关系，还有25个人，我加油。好难受，我也挺难受的。
All right, so all of this was kind of very hypothetical and extraordinarily interesting. But I'll give you an example of a project that we just completed. You may find it hard to believe that we just completed it because I've been talking about it ever since you've known me. And this is our mother literacy project or maternal literacy project that we conducted in India, really starting in 2009, but we just kind of finally finished it in terms of writing the paper, submitting it. So the mother literacy project or maternal literacy project, it targeted mothers in rural areas in India that had young children. Children basically.
其中有一半是我
你在说什么？
扛了上海。
你给我扛的，
好像有10个吧？你有10个是我在场内冲锋，只有2个摄影机。
你这数学有点问题啊！你这数学。
我不知道是谁杀12个人。
你这数学真的有点问题。
有10个是我在前面拉枪线，你在后面。
妹妹，有的时候活在自己的幻想里是好事，但是人还是得清醒。
Either just entering primary school or just having kind of been enrolled in primary school. The idea behind targeting mothers of kids that had kids that were this age is because we really wanted to see what the impact of teaching mothers to read would be on the children. And our theory was that, you know, I have an 11-year-old. He does not listen to me or his mother, right? And so if we suddenly did an intervention where we suddenly taught me how to work with my son and on his homework, or we taught his mother how to kind of do little games, he wouldn't care at all. All he wants to do is his video games or play with his friends, right? We thought that maybe kids that were age 4 to 8 might still listen to their mothers and might spend more time with their mothers, so we thought that this was the appropriate target for mothers. What was the intervention? Well, there were 2 interventions. One were these daily mother literacy classes, where the organization we were working with, Pratham, they would go into villages, they would find volunteers, they would train those volunteers on how to teach basic adult literacy and numeracy skills. They used the pedagogy that they had found very effective with children, but then they would kind of adapt it to the needs and interests of adults, and they would form groups of 5 to 20, mostly 20 mothers, and have the volunteer teach those mothers every day for about an hour. They use the pedagogy that they had found very effective with children, but then they would kind of adapt it to the needs and interests of adults, and they would form groups of 5 to 20, mostly 20 mothers, and have the volunteer teach those mothers every day for about an hour or 2. We had a second intervention called the Child Home Activities and Materials Program, that was not conducted by volunteers, it was conducted by Pratham staff. It was weekly, and it was a door-to-door intervention where they had their list of mothers that we had identified, and they went to those mothers and they said, you know, here is, this is what your child's homework looks like. This is how to tell if your child has completed their assignments. This is what a graded assignment looked like. This red X is a bad thing. This check mark is a good thing. They basically taught the mothers, who themselves may have never had any kind of formal education. In fact, almost 80% of them had never attended any kind of formal education, never attended school. Basically taught them how to kind of interpret homework assignments and things like this and how to monitor it with their children. And the unit of analysis was the children. Ultimately, we were measuring the literacy outcomes of mothers, but ultimately we were really interested in the literacy outcomes of the children.
我还是 double A。那个
Right. So it's Pratham, obviously. So we were working in India, and we wanted to do this in 2 separate areas. We wanted to run this intervention in an area where literacy levels were low, but we wanted 2 different contexts. We wanted to enhance the external validity of this.
我也不能干做，对吧？我只能口嗨，只能是，对吧？我觉得
experiment. So we chose Bihar and Rajasthan.
我很艰难，我活得很艰难。
So let's focus on Bihar for now, because it has actually how we did the sampling is a lot more interesting there.
我没有说出来，你这个说。
6
So this is a state map of Bihar, and Pratham wanted to work in the areas that had the lowest levels of literacy. So they wanted to work in East Bihar, which is kind of on the border of West Bengal. All right. It also has the lowest female literacy levels within Bihar. That was one thing that was special about Rajasthan, which was the other state we were working in, is that it had the lowest literacy. So this is a state map of Bihar, and Pratham wanted to work in the areas that had the lowest levels of literacy. So they wanted to work in East Bihar, which is kind of on the border of West Bengal. All right. It also has the lowest female literacy levels within Bihar. That was one thing that was special about Rajasthan, which was the other state we were working in, is that it had the lowest female literacy rates in the entire country. So that's kind of why we chose those 2. All right. So our sampling frame was quite simple when we wrote the proposal. Like, we didn't want to spend too much time identifying which groups of kids to work with and the names of those kids and their mothers and all that. We decided that we would work with existing Pratham classes. So in these areas, Pratham was administering its Read India program. And in its Read India program, they were holding classes of about 20 children. It was perfect. And in those classes, they would teach the children basic literacy interventions.
你已进入1级战备状态，加油，特种兵！你已进入1级战备状态，加油，特种兵！
你等着，妹妹，对，我给你找一个正宗的教你的。你这太不正宗了。等会儿。
还有正宗的。
必须的。
必须给我读，我们要东北的必须。
我给你找一个完全那个的。
必须，等一下那调调对，东北那个必须。
係呀，不是。
必須的。
你等着，我给你找一个非常正宗的。嘎嘎正宗。就是吧，它可能比较慢。
慢。必须。你也学不会。
你为什么说那个东北话，说着特别像那个，一下子声音都变了。
A was kind of a ready sample for us. B, those families had already expressed some kind of interest in doing this kind of extra learning thing. So we thought that if they were already interested in sending their kids to these supplementary literacy classes, these in the communities, that maybe then they would be more likely to be interested in maybe having the mothers also attend literacy classes. So we wrote that in our proposal. They're usually, what we said is, so we thought that if B, having the mothers also. So we wrote that in our proposal. They're usually, what we said is, there are usually 1 to 2 Read India classes per village in this area, with about 20 students per class. So our sampling frame will come from the initial enrollment rosters from Read India classes. It was great. We were all set. After we won the proposal from 3IE, we presented the research design in Delhi. And a number of people thought, don't you think they're taking a big risk by targeting kids that are already in Read India classes? If what you're expecting is to get these kids by teaching their mothers, who might be able to help them with some basic remedial skills, if they're already in Read India classes, don't you think they might be getting those skills anyways? And therefore the added benefit of these adult literacy classes is going to be really small. We said, yes, maybe, but that's also worth knowing. And the fact is that if Pratham were to scale this program up, they would scale it on top of their existing Read India classes. So we were pretty confident. That was our assumption. Then we had a conversation with the head of Pratham. And he, as we kind of shared with our RAs in a Skype chat later, Madhav wants to conduct this in untouched locations. Our plan to get child lists from Read India is dead. So what were the implications of that? Yeah. So we then would have to conduct a census, which would cost us an extra $100,000. We did not tell 3IE this at the time, and then we had to kind of go begging for money later on. But it had more than just budget implications, because with Read India classes, we had already identified families or households that were kind of expressed some interest in supplementary classes. Now we were going to go into brand new areas where we had no idea what the interest would be. And if we went into a village of, say, 300 households, and we didn't know, and we sampled, say, a random sample of those 300 households, and only 10 households expressed interest in classes, then if we sampled, say, 20 households, the probability that any one of those households that we would have sampled would have actually taken up the adult literacy class was really low. And therefore, any effect, and only 10 households expressed interest in classes, then if we sampled, say, 20 households, the probability that any one of those households that we would have sampled would have actually taken up the adult literacy class was really low. And therefore, any effect that we would ultimately measure would be diluted by the fact that most of the people in our sample would not have taken any classes at all. And so it would be really hard to detect an effect. So we were concerned about that. So one, we had to find an area in Bihar that was unspoiled. Pratham was all over Bihar. So we had to find a district where there was no Pratham. We had to find areas where there would likely be high demand from mothers. We had to make sure that the clusters were not too small. We didn't want to work in villages that just had, or sorry, like little hamlets that had like 5 households, because our sample, our power calculations assumed that we would have about 20 households per cluster. It couldn't be too big, because like I said before, if Pratham went in, they conducted these mother literacy classes, 20 mothers showed up out of 300, then we'd have a really diluted results amongst all the households that weren't included. We wanted take-ups basically to be about above 50%. So if Pratham was running classes of about 20, we didn't want there to be too many more than 40 households in our cluster. We also wanted to minimize spillovers. If these clusters were too close to each other, it's possible that, one, we could have crossovers where mothers from neighboring hamlets attended these classes. Another concern is that if the kids are doing better and they're best friends with kids from a control hamlet, then there might be peer effects. So we were concerned about that. And the last thing is that we wanted somewhat homogeneous hamlets, in that if a...
你去哪里走嘛？
我听不到脚步，去哪里？
姐妹，你是走错了，左边，左边，左边。
我又。
六。
姐姐。
哎。
牛逼不？
扶姐姐一下。
我就说1条4的吧，哎呀。
好吧。
这完全不虚，你看，你看看，你看，你看。你看看，你倒了，我就只能救你。看我
Hamlet was had too much heterogeneity in terms of religion and caste, and these households didn't work with each other. Then again, that might limit the likelihood that we would get a bunch of them to attend a class all at once, right? So maybe if, say, people from one religion attended, then the people of the other religion would just automatically not attend. So that was another thing that we were concerned about. So ultimately, we wanted to identify target habitations of about 20 to 100 houses.
是呢，但凡不是那颗雷。
有药了。
你姐姐都不一定能死掉呢。
是吗？
那没事。
万一死了，你会说看我打，那种感觉也不错。
就是你现在是越来越敢讲了，是？
人在哪啊，姐姐？
妹妹，下！冲！
我，
因为这喷子真的不适合冲啊！这喷子怎么
样？
喷子打不过喷子。打谁？喷子，妹妹她好在，她在。
我知道。
嗨，你好。哎，这是个女孩子哎。嗨，女孩子。咱俩好歹之前一起死了嘛，非常公平啊！是不是说好一起死了嘛？你做到了呀，是不是嘛？一起死了呀，对不对？
我想活着。
起码一起死了，就如愿以偿了已经。把要求那么多了。
我没有活着，我也把着活5分钟。
那我这把是不是跟你一起死了嘛？
你想死，我不想死啊！
那这把咱俩一起活着吗？
你已进入1级战备状态，加油，特种兵！你已进入1级战备状态。
哎呀，
特种兵！
天晚上我打了没有？
怎么
我
说的好惨？我心疼你什么？
你心疼吗？我咋看着感觉你在笑呢？哎呀！
哎，等会儿。
现在跳，烟火在
等会儿，
燃烧。
你等一下，我妈叫我一下。等会
啊！我妈也在叫我哎，干嘛？哦，知道了，好的，等一下哦，知道了，哎，我懂，可以了吗，姐姐？上吗？
飞机很快就要起飞了，各位特种兵请准备。
OK.
So here was our district. We had to first identify, sorry, this is the state of Bihar. We had to identify the district that Pratham was not working in. So we identified Purnia. Purnia was the district they weren't working in. Second, within Purnia, Purnia has about a population of about 2 million or a little over 2 million. We weren't prepared to work in something that large, so we wanted to identify some blocks that we could work in. So we randomly, of all the blocks that there were, which were maybe about 10 or 12 blocks, we randomly sampled 2 here, Damdaha. So we worked in Damdaha and B Koti, and this is what those blocks look like. Right? And within these blocks, there were 81 villages. Now, the definition of a village is not totally obvious. These are revenue villages. Within each of these villages, so within this block, we had a population of about 200,000.
我上吧，可是就问你的哦。哎呀，
怎么着？这是得吹多久？这得说多久？
你都打那么久，你都没有去过我一次哎，我可是就问你的哦。
哦。可以。
有句话叫什么？你飞得好慢呢。我们都在想着。
请就飞得慢。
我们死那么快，我们死得快是有原因的，我突然发现。
OK， 非常好。你已经现在到了互相责怪的阶段了啊。
我没有这么想。
可以，行。你伤害了我。
我没有一笑而过，真的。
这是个人吧？真是个人。
你要枪不？我可以给你一把兔兔。
什么枪？
喷子。
你抽是吧？
死的那喷子手里。
我怕你死。
那我就给你捡一把。
你牛着吧，我怕你没有。
要不你拿着吧。
没事，你拿着吧。你是我的队友，好东西我都应该给你。
So each of these villages was like several thousand people. And we wanted 200,000. So each of these villages was like several thousand. Each of these villages, so within this block, we had a population of about. Now the definition of a village is. And within these blocks, there were 81 villages. Now the definition of a village is a little bit is not totally obvious. These are revenue villages. Within each of these villages, so within this block, we had a population of about 200,000. So each of these villages was like several thousand. We wanted much smaller. We wanted between 20 and 100 households. So what we did is we went into each of these villages, and the good thing is that not everyone in a village lives in a big cluster. They live in small hamlets that are often ethnically or religiously divided. It's fortunate for our sampling, not for people in general.
他加药，前面往前面走右拐，往前走右拐。
右拐是哪？我左右不分。
不该你，你左右不分，我怎么想到你左右不分呢？不该你，真一点都不该你，我姐姐的错，我的错啊！这谁能想到你左右不分呢？没有关系，
我也没想到我左右不分。
别难受，别哭。没事，
我没有哭啊。
没有方向感这件事情不是你的错。不要紧。
我没有哭，你不要想太多了。这不尝试嘛？
啊？
打比较快。
不用，狗跟团给我了。
你已进入1级战备状态，加油，特种兵！你已进入1级战备状态，加油，特种兵！
我们俩一起回到这里。哎呀，你不要，你走。哎呀，你不要。哎呀，你不要把他走，你不要。哎呀，你把他放我这个。我不跟你搞，我把他扛起来了。 哎呀，不要把它拿走！我真服，我4个月没跑到不过了，没哪一天不在我身上。你刚洗完澡，我跟说那个人民币一样，那我贼拉抢手。我4个月没排账号。
飞机很快
就要起飞了，各位特种兵，
谢妮妮的爱的折鹤，谢的爱的折鹤，谢 YZ 的万里挑一，谢空白的漏灯牌，谢有点懒的爱的折鹤，谢谢烂人起的捏捏小脸，瞎子的真爱你瞎子，谢谢半的晚上烟花，谢谢半，谢谢。
记得飞法哦。
因为现在真的要跟你飞了，我爸过来了。现在真的没骗你。
Not for people in this case, a lot of times by caste divided. That's fortunate for our sampling, not for people in general. I won't make that claim. So we went into each of these villages, and our teams did it ethnically or religiously, or here in this case, a lot of times by caste divided.
谢小赖哥带的折鹤，谢小赖哥。谢难以不入带的折鹤。谢石头画带的折鹤，谢南子墨的捏捏小脸，谢谢你这位薄荷糖带的折鹤。我们把它放这个。啊？我不行。我不行。那你要把它送上。
Ethnically or religiously, or here in this case, a lot of times by caste divided. In a village lives in a big cluster. They live in, we wanted between 20 and 100 households. So what we did is we went into each of these villages, and the good thing is that, you know, not everyone in a village lives in a big cluster. They live in small hamlets that are often like ethnically or religiously, or here in this case, a lot of times by caste divided. That's fortunate for our sampling, not for people in general. I won't make that claim. So we went into each of these villages, and our teams did it, and they would try to map out where the hamlets were, or the habitations, or in Bihar they're called podas. They're called mohellas in Rajasthan. So I've blocked these out because now we're getting to enough detail where I don't want you to identify the individuals we were working with. So we basically identified our clusters, which were these hamlets, by going into each village and mapping it out, and basically conducting what we called a rural resource assessment, that's what it is called, where you basically get an estimate of the population of each of these hamlets, thing it out, and basically conducting what we called a rural resource assessment, where you basically get an estimate of the population of each of these. Talk to the village leader for the most part, and you know, in this village there happened to be 9 hamlets, of which some of them kind of met our criteria. This one was a little bit too big. This village there happened to be 9 hamlets, of which some of them kind of met our criteria. This one was a little bit too big. This one was a little bit too small, and so we were able to. And you know, in this village there happened to be 9 hamlets, of which some of them kind of met our criteria. This one was a little bit too big. This one was a little bit too small, and so we were able to identify the hamlets that were kind of met our criteria. Next, we were concerned about spillover. Right. So then we looked at all those villages. We geotagged each of the eligible hamlets. We looked at the distance between them. And so for some that were relatively isolated, we could say, okay, that was an eligible village, we'll work, or hamlet, we'll work in that. That's part of our sample. If there were cases where there were 2 hamlets that were very close to each other, in our case, less than 500 meters, so that's what this distance thing calculated, we would randomly select one. In cases where there were, say, 3 villages that were close to each other, and we could take kind of 2 ends, we would take 2 ends. So it was a really complicated process to determine which were the hamlets in our 500 meters. So that's it's relatively isolated. We could say, okay, that was an eligible, right? So then we looked at all those villages. We geotagged each of the eligible hamlets. We looked at the distance between them. And so for some that were relatively isolated, we could say, okay, that was an eligible village. We'll work for hamlet. We'll work in that. That's part of our sample. If there were cases where there were 2 hamlets that were very close to each other, in our case, less than 500 meters, so that's what this distance thing calculated, we would randomly select one. In cases where there were, say, 3 villages that were close to each other, and we could take kind of 2 ends, we would take 2 ends. So it was a really complicated process to determine which were the hamlets in our sample. Okay, so just keep your awake. We conducted a rural resource assessment primarily because we needed to identify. In cases where there were, say, 3 villages that were close to each other, and we could take kind of 2 ends, we would take 2 ends. So it was a really complicated process to determine which were the hamlets in our.
不要听我。你怎么没呢？你等会儿，妹妹，比你小的肚子呢。
It out and basically conducting what we called a rural resource assessment, or that's what it is called, where you basically get an estimate of the population of each of these.
滑下去
We
了，
talk to
你
the
这
village
跑
leader.
的不行啊！小鹿是不是脚滑了一下呀？
我刚准备好好打，你在干什么？
你准备，我这
你可不可以？哎呀，等会儿，我肚子疼。我刚准备好好打，你被打到。
你自己要说跟着你，要你直接爬下去。
你跟着我，你人呢？你跟着我。
So actually, it was B. At this point, we were only identifying which were the eligible clusters. It was the fact that Pratham was not in this area and it had very low literacy levels that helped us decide where the location of the study was, and we haven't yet gotten to our list of households. All right, so now, once we identified each of the hamlets in which we were going to work, each of the tolas, we went into that tola and we created another map. So now we're at about 300 tolas in Bihar. Created a map of all the households. And we conducted a census.
Okay.
And in that census, we looked at variables that would help us identify who would be target mothers, and also things that might predict take-up. So this was our census form. It asked kind of religion, what language they spoke, and then a household roster to get a sense of like which children were eligible. So the most important eligibility criteria was that the mothers had to have children between the age of 4 and 8. And so from our census, we were able to identify eligible mothers from here. And then what we wanted to do is identify 20 households, eligible households per habitation. And then we wanted to add 5 children. So we had our whole list of household IDs from the census. We take a random number, we sort it, and then we take the top 20 and say those were our households that were in our sample in each village or in each hamlet. And then we create these kind of buffer households. And the idea was a census was a very rough and dirty exercise, so it's possible that sometimes we would select a household that would be misidentified, the roster would be wrong, and so if we went to that household later, found out they had no children at all, we'd drop it and choose a buffer. You can do that in the baseline. You can't do that later on. All right. So again, are you paying attention? For replacements, yeah, buffer is for replacements. So basically, once you decide that a household is actually not eligible, you pull from the buffer, because we wanted 20 households per hamlet.
不要紧。你知不知道有一个词叫做“你跳伞慢了”？
啊！哇！他们好快啊！我们太强了，我们让他们一下好吧？
哎，你但凡说点什么话我都信。你说咱们太强了，太棒了！25分钟都没活过，
就是给他们一点
压力是吧？
机会。
OK。
你要枪吗？
All right.
不给你。
Okay. So that's how we got our sample. It's not a clean process. It's very complicated. It's not that common that when working in low-income countries, you're going to have a ready-made list of households that you can sample from, or a ready-made list of clusters that you can just randomly sample from, or when working in low-income countries that you're going to have a ready-made list of households that you can just randomly sample from, or a ready-made list of clusters that you can randomly assign to treatment and control groups. All right, so let me just quickly go over how we did the randomization in the maternal literacy program. But first, let me kind of review the different types of randomization that one could do. This is not that you can randomly assign to treatment and control groups. All right, so let me just quickly go over how we did the randomization in the maternal literacy program. But first, let me kind of review the different types of randomization that one could do. This is not to be confused with like phased how we did the randomization in the maternal literacy program. But first, let me kind of review the different types of randomization that one could do. This is not to be confused with like phase-in, encouragement design, things like that. This is literally how do you program them already.
等会我没跟上，我没跟上。
OK。我操，我好牛啊！
你好牛。你打谁了？
哎，没有人投啊！
你打谁了？你好牛！
这系统。 你要吗？
系统奇怪。
我好像杀了人，没有给我特技杀。
妹妹在我这边。
完了。哎呀，后面有人！打金毛啊！
你等会儿。
你好帅啊
！That when working in low-income countries, that you're going to have a ready-made list of households that you can just randomly sample from, or even a ready-made list of clusters that you can randomly assign to treatment and control. And that when working in low-income countries, that you're going to have a ready-made. It's not that common that when working in low-income countries, that you're going to have a ready-made list of households that you can randomly sample, even a ready-made list of clusters that you can randomly assign to treatment and control. All right, so let me just quickly go over how we did the randomization in our program. But first, let me kind of review the different types of randomization that one could do. This is not to be confused with.
哎呀，
那你没办法，这喷子打不了。但凡多一点水就能打过了。OK， 妹妹，给你来一个。
走不出去的，我们走不出去的。
让你看看正宗的必须。
啊，必须是吧？
来，想学什么？把你刚刚那个说一遍。
大字花，大字花。
不是，把你想学的那个东西说一遍。
必须的。
泽华生，他想学这个，你教他一下。
必须的。
必须的。
必须的，跟我读。
必须的。
西必。
我必须的，就是那个。
必须的。
必须的。
哎。
可是我要东北味儿那个。
我电话又丢了。
你电话还不在手里拿着吗？
我上多少钱那时候找全球500了。那他要在警务库里。
完了，这哥酒喝多了。
大哥不太靠谱啊。
不是，又丢了。没啊，搁这。
他好像完了，他好像不太聪明。
怎么事？
他是不是喝多了？
没有。来，你俩说话，我小点声来。1000万的大粉丝搁这呢。
什么呀
？1000万的主播搁这，1000万的我跟1000万的粉丝玩呢啊。
说你呀？
啥主播啊，姐姐？你呀？
他说啥呀？我不知道，刚好刚对我也拉的。
With like phase-in, encouragement design, things like that. This is literally how do you program the randomization. So there's first way is simple randomization, which is kind of the equivalent of a flip of a coin. Every single household has, say, equal likelihood of being in treatment and control, or sorry, every cluster has an equal likelihood. So, or if you were to do a random number generator, if you got a random number over 0.5, they would be treatment, under 0.5, they would be control, something like that. And at the end, if you had, say, 100 clusters in your sample, you might end up with 55 in the treatment, 45 in the control, just by random chance. There's complete randomization, which is kind of where you really, if you have 100 households, you want exactly 50 in the treatment, 50 in the control, and that's when you do random number assigning and sorting, and then you take the top 50, that's your treatment, the bottom 50, that's your control, after sorting randomly. Stratified randomization, where instead of taking all 100, you may break those 100 into different groups based on, say, 50 are in Rajasthan, 50 are in Bihar, 25 are in this block, 25 are in this block, and within those you do your randomization. You can take stratification all the way to the extreme where you ultimately match villages. Where you say this village, here's a cluster of 2 villages, and then one of them is going to be in treatment, one of them is going to be in control. So you take your entire sample of clusters, and you randomly assign each one. So you take your entire sample, you pair each cluster up, and then you randomly assign each one of that pair into the treatment or control. So that's an extreme form. Or you could just do randomization, whether complete or simple. Look at the balance. If you like it, great. If you don't, you can re-randomize. Or you can do something where you kind of have a rule. You say, I'm going to randomize 1,000 times. And I'm going to take the one randomization that is the most balanced. That's one thing that you can do. So Miriam Brun and David McKinsey wrote a paper about this, which we'll share. It basically compared these different methods. And what they found is that really the stratified randomization and pairwise randomization got you the best balance. Re-randomizing 1,000 times and taking the best has a lot of issues. Actually, statistically, there's reasons why you don't want to do that as well. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this course. All right. So this is kind of what we did in our study. We did something that's like a pairwise randomization, but instead, because we had a mother literacy program, we had a child at home program, and then we combined the two, and then we had a control group. We had 4 groups. Instead of pairwise randomization, we created clusters of 4. Right? But instead, because we had a mother literacy program, we had a child at home program, and then we combined the two, and then we had a control group. We had 4 groups. Instead of pairwise randomization, we created clusters of 4. Right? So how did this work? So in Rajasthan, we had 240 villages. In Bihar, we had 240 or hamlets. There were 12 custom teams in each. And so each team was assigned 20 hamlets or 20 habitations. Okay. So how within this 20, 5 would get the champ intervention. 5 would get 5 would get the mother literacy intervention with no champ. 5 would get the champ intervention with no mother literacy. 5 would get both. And then there would be 5 control. So what this meant is that each team had 10 champ villages and 10 mother literacy villages, right? So we had to randomize within this 20. But we decided, let's make it more complicated. Instead of just randomizing within this 20, let's sort these households by, sort these clusters by cluster size into groups of 4. So something like that pairwise randomization. So we had clusters of 4, and then within those 4, we randomly assigned 1 to treatment 1, treatment 2, treatment 3, and control. Got it? All right. And so some of those, but we decided let's make it more. Instead of just randomizing within this 20, let's sort these households by. All right. And so some of those, so we took the biggest clusters, put them together, the smallest clusters, put them together, and randomized. So in a sense, we were now stratifying on a continuous variable, which was number of households within each cluster. So this is something that Hito Imbin suggests you do not do. He says actually stratifying by cluster size is great. Pairwise randomization is not a good idea because a lot of statistical reasons. And so we kind of listened to him with one ear and the other ear. All right, so how did this work? Basically, we had our villages, we had village size, we sorted by village size, and then we created strata. 4 groups that were the smallest villages, 4 groups that were the largest villages, and so on. So there, we have kind of 20 but really segments of 4. And so we were ready to do our randomization, and then Rakdam said, well, clusters of 20 is great, but really, like, we're going to have 12 teams, and we want each team to be responsible for, 10 mother literacy interventions, 10 mother literacy clusters. We want each team to be responsible for 10 champ clusters. But they can't do all 10 and 10 at the same time. So we'd like to split this into 2 phases. So we'd like to have clusters of 10. So each team was responsible for 20, but they'd be responsible for 10 in the first phase and 10 in the second phase. And so now, our 5-5-5-5, so if anyone has ever tried to divide 10 for groups, it's really hard to get equal numbers. We weren't dividing villages in half. So basically what we ended up deciding, furthermore, each team wanted to be able to do 5 champ villages in one phase and 5 mother literacy villages in one phase. So we have 2, 3, 2, 3. Right? So when we randomized each of these kind of sets, phases, some of them got this allocation, and some of them kind of got the reverse allocation. So now what we want to do is we want to cluster by strata. I'm sorry, we want to cluster by sets as 20. We want to cluster by phase. We want to cluster by household size. Groups, I'm sorry, household size, sorry, cluster size, village size. Right? And we want to randomize such that each team gets exactly 5 champ villages and 5 mother literacy villages each phase. So how do we do it? We use data. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So basically what we do is we kind of, we did the blocking, but now we separated the villages into phase. You had, on this side, again, those phases we decided to make geographically similar 10 sets of 10 villages. So 10 here, 10 here. sorted by village size. We created blocks where we took the villages that had the smallest villages and the largest villages within each phase set. And we basically randomized within those. And we did something that's similar to like what's called a Latin square randomization to ensure that there was kind of balance. And then we had these two remainder villages, and we randomized those such that they would basically balance out in the end, such that we would always have each team responsible for 5 other 5 champ villages each phase. So this is what it looks like in our paper. Have all these strategies.
唱一段，让我想起了之前，有点想哭了。
不哭。
有枪了。
杜江手速挺快呀。妹妹上。
我不，他俩，我不。
嗯。
我怎么感觉听到声了？
从我这来了。 保镖呢？
标记了一处地点。
你保镖保你啥了？他保你啥了？保你旁边的空气稀薄。
你这边有人吗，老大？
有。
标记了一处地点。
在这儿。
妹妹别去那边，妹妹。
找一个。
我屋里。
我到老大。
我知道姐姐。 我不会过去了。
哎，我倒了，妈的，不好意思。
哎，不是，啥？
啊，好快乐呀！
哎，兄弟，能不能给次机会？兄弟们，能不能给个机会？
你把我们队友杀了，
我没有，我就出去看看，我衣服刚没干，我就倒了，我晾衣服呢。 太残忍了，小姑娘怎么能残忍呢？我就出去晾个衣服，看看干没干，你们就给我打了。
哎呀，
他应该蛮残的吧？就是。
All right. So just to review, there are several methods of stratification. You can stratify by categorical variables like.
好好打吧，我饭桶妹妹都快哭了。
好。
我没有哭，我真没有哭。
哎，咱打海岛不行吗？
行，满足你一下。
好，满足我。园林树远类。
You can stratify by continuous verification. You can stratify by categorical variables like district block. You can stratify by continuous variables, but then you have to kind of create blocks based on those continuous variables, like villages of similar size. You can do all the way down to pairwise or kind of groupwise stratification, which is what we did, which is probably not a great idea. And then there's Latin square random assignment, where across different stratums you're trying to enforce balance. And then you can do re-randomization, which you should not do. And then last thing I just want to mention is that tips and tricks, even though you shouldn't re-randomize, you should always test balance or make sure that your randomization code works. So what that means is that we probably it took us probably 1,000 iterations of the randomization code to get it. We'd do it and it would be totally imbalanced. We wouldn't know why. And we'd we'd fix the code, we'd re-randomize and whatever. So re-randomizing while you're testing is totally fine. That's totally fine. Just to make sure that your code works. And the way, in that you're getting balanced groups. Then, once you've decided that your code works, that's when you decide, okay, everyone huddle around, this is the time that we're going to run the randomization, the final time. And you run it, and you stick to it. Unless it's really unbalanced. And then and a last trick that David McKenzie from the World Bank suggests is creating waitlists. So waitlists are sometimes, if you go to clusters and you find that those clusters are totally not interested in intervention, right? But Pratham has already promised to do 240 mother literacy classes, and you find 40 of the villages are not interested. It's good to have, as part of your large random sample of clusters, a set of buffer clusters. Now, those buffer clusters will never be part of your study. You will never collect data from them. But they are a way of ensuring that your partner organization can reach its target of 240 clusters without dipping into the control group. So that's another tip and trick. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope that was informative. It was a very complicated design, but it's usually not easy. It's usually not that hard, but it's usually not easy. And hopefully we got to touch on a lot of the things that you need to take into account. All right, thanks.
咱有的时候真的就是没事，勇敢妹妹。
这个地方再有2队有2人不玩的。
哦，
手出汗了。
没事没事。
要不然不能断处。又一队。哎呀我的妈！我躲不起呀，我也不行，我还躲不起吗？
我刚才在刷微博，说那个热搜，说大 S 突然癫痫复发，因为许金燕在大 S 癫痫前决策大 S 2.2亿的财产，然后底下一个评论说他是光头，不是黑旋风。2.2亿说卷走就卷走。给我笑的不行。
骗你不是人。
啊？刚他说啥？
不改变的
不是。不是，就是他说的。我刚才刷微博，他的热搜啊，这不是跳伞吗？我寻思说没事儿，我就看一下微博热搜。完了之后，他说大 S 今天癫痫复发，为什么？说因为君金燕在大 S 癫痫复发前卷走了他2.2个亿的财产，然后底下评论说他是光头，不是黑旋风。
听到了一声踩2楼的声音。
会不会是我
？2.2亿说卷走就卷走。
应该听错了。
对吗？
哎，老大，哎，好嘞。
不行了，他是光头，不是黑旋风。哎呦妈，受不了！
标记了一处地点。
啊，这不行了，这一天天的。哎呦哎，真离谱啊！他是光头，不是黑旋风。啊！
一个雷没捡着。
有人啊！有人。
你的队啊！
不用说了。
在说说了。
不用说了。这有人。
前方有危险！前方有危险！
我感受到了。不是，谁救我于水火之中啊？
你干嘛？你在哪里？
我在。
别慌，别着急。
给你放个烟，不需要吧？不需要取消了。
给我放个烟，哎，真善良。
别搁那头走啊，往这边走啊！
你这海岛子这。
来到楼顶。
蛮惨的，超惨。我觉得可以上一波。
哎，后面。
上不了。
你也挺惨的。
双拼楼顶啊！
标记了一处地点。
缺氧。
再弄了3个。
双拼楼顶还有。
现在是楼顶的是吗？现在是我们要的是。
我来了。我现在是不是已经超过2分钟了？
咱不唠，我就是刚好看到了，戳中我的笑点。新闻肯定是假的，就是那个形容非常好笑。
我给你药呗，我有3瓶饮料。
天黑跑。
等会儿，我现在不缺药，我现在缺大药包。你先打着哈，我去看看。
他们打下来了。
OK。
厉害。
这种事情让男人去战斗。
帮我们看一下。我这。
完了，倒了。2个，没打动。
我是真没要啊，我是。刚捡这个长贴。也多叫还是可以的。
给你放个烟，等一下，你这放错了。
没了吗？
没关系。有2个。
OK。等着我点啊。
等一下。
我快了。
坚持一下。
要去帮一下多酱。
我去帮照一下他，1楼。
我断处了。
吓死我了！
救到你了吧？ 我跟你说，我一直在给你架着枪呢。
可是，
哎呀，那个怎么也拉起来了？
就我跟你说，
三杀向下。
我给你架着
呢。
呢。
那个怎么也拉起来了？
真的要谢谢姐姐，我跟你说，我枪口一直都没移呢。
是，哦，
但凡移点，你人就没了。
哦，有点懵。哎呀。
哎，实力不减当年。
哎呀，这晚上吃点火锅有问题。
有点儿。
狗屁疼！
完了，我老断处。
怎么说啊？我们
就已经断处了，咋办？
那啥，打车站吧，摇车。我有车。
收到。
我没车皮。
我有，没事。
箭头有。
去摇个车吧。
摇车吗？
嗯。
楠姐说咋地，咱就咋地。
OK。
楠姐说怎么整，咱就怎么整。不行，有半个补子。
去摇个车，我们。
收到。所以我听楠姐的还是听你的？
你听他的吧，这样能怪他。你听我的，我不信怪你。
你真是啊！
来车了，
来车了。
要啥来啥。
你看这个。
行了。
这不是他。不是。No，不是。
他跑掉了。真的不给他打死。
你能为兄弟两肋插刀，你也能为你媳妇插我2刀。
哎，这真人！
哎，
他有3一枪，
标记了一处地点，
就1枪点1枪就来，是1枪吧？
嗯。
好了。
哎，没剩忍机呢。
他一个人跑过来，不太科学。
吓跑了。
玩去睡吧，这么结束我要睡了。
哎，原来有局。
打血。
3点。
螳螂，一个螳螂，红螳螂。
太穷了。
你有背镜吗？我有背镜。
我有。
哦，我没问你。嗨。
哎呦我的妈呀！自作多情。
点个3倍吧，你们要就这样。
我这儿有好东西，快来！
不要。我来了。我左边还有人。
哎，有人扔雷了。
有人来了。
我操！
我知道。
哎呦我的妈！我坐雷上了。哎呀！
什么位置，东哥？
怎么断处断的这么邪乎呢？
哪打的你啊？
哦，有雷！
你屁股后。
我的屁股被震了一下。
就这一个。
这人怎么这么多雷呀？你快死了！
别
我你妈连上去。
3个人。
你跑这头干什么来了？
我来这头架山顶那边来了。
OK。
屋里还有一个，我窗口。
我操！这太不值，延迟也太高了吧！ 我太好猜。
那个，我先撤了哈。
我也困了呢，你成困了。
好，拜拜，妹妹，我先走，我先走了。好，拜拜。
啊，下播，我走了，拜拜。
哇。来吧，我们下班吧，我得去。哇，我就出一身汗。我估计今晚这个火锅有点问题。哎，知道了。我估计今晚这个火锅有点问题。我给我淌一身虚汗。年纪大了。OK， 谢谢画个圈圈祝福你带来的折贺，谢谢宁轩带来的折贺，谢谢谁不喜欢衬衫呀的棒棒糖，谢谢，谢谢天气带来的折贺，谢谢男总家爱和女斗稀饭的小孩的漏灯牌。哎，有12点了吗？再等个7分钟吧。谢谢风吹的神枪手，谢谢，也不差这几分钟了，我们先绑吧。没关系，加快一下进程就好了。刚要等7分钟。还好了，在喝水而已，问题不大。回来了，水土不服怎么可能？我哪里有那么娇小？不对，娇弱。其实还好了，来吧，刚好5分钟，来得及。叉 C 玩，恒玩，陈小排玩，毒 C 小葱玩，南方的是南方玩，蓝心玩，小玩，男生玩，小倩不是鬼66玩，7、8分熟的咸鱼玩，汤搞笑玩，月亮美不过，南方躺在我怀里玩，陆小叮当玩 K 玩13玩，叛逆的无锡迪西玩，阿紫玩，以西玩，就一个玩，隔壁小王的咖啡玩，南总家的小浪瓜玩，风银丸、赢了晚风丸、妮妮丸、安然于铁丸、YZ 丸、高小猴丸、尼古拉斯翠花丸、随便放丸、荔枝味薄荷糖丸、C 思明好丸、南总家的漫步丸、小新的盐汽水丸、摘星星给你玩，不想失眠丸、小11丸、ZGG 丸、The One 丸。是小狼要玩南总家的宁轩玩，有点懒玩南总把烦恼关掉晚安，爱家的3日晚安，是 XY 玩花季玩，于思南玩321嘎玩，谁不喜欢衬衫呀玩，白羊座拿铁玩南总家爱喝绿豆稀饭的小孩玩，你把名字改回来了。大年丸、国欧丸、仔仔丸、子月苏苏丸、楠楠丸、七七抱抱丸、My Darling 丸、葛优丸、小橘子儿丸、迪迦说南方很潮丸、祭司丸、嘿嘿小傻瓜丸、尾巴丸、南方的陀螺丸、黑鸭丸、翠翠丸、苏小小要努力丸。画个圈圈祝福你玩南总家的流年玩，辟谣辟谣臭屁谣玩， XJYYY 玩南方的生菜玩， 石路花晚安，南总家的 YG 晚安，南子墨晚安，南也不落晚安，谢雨晚安，空白晚安，讨厌喝水晚安，浮生归风晚安，烂人齐晚安，我的宝贝老婆晚安，用户7426晚安，翻 H 晚安，天气晚安，南总家的白羽毛晚安，南方的风吹晚安，某人晚安，奶气 S 晚安，树莓晚安，56晚安，思密号晚安，尼普晚安，木鸡懒猫晚安，不会说话的哒晚安，拉个朗日橙子晚安，44只狮子晚安，小鱼晚安，99晚安，南总家鱼儿的斑斑，南总家的鱼儿晚安，你头发掉了晚安，骨刺不湿鼻晚安，思故渊晚安，韩老师晚安，阿楚晚安，Kona 晚安 ，Conan 怎么读？晚安安，虚晚安晚安，蛙曲晚安，旺仔牛奶糖晚安，景思密号晚安，南总花式嘎晚安，温文尔雅晚安，南方的海胆晚安，喜之郎果冻不礼貌晚安，学姐成熟稳重是美女晚安，古月晚安，海龟别跑晚安。SOYAA 晚安 WQI 晚安，再会晚安，南总家的宝贝乖乖晚安，有木瓜纸膜晚安，210730晚安，云生晚安，冒泡的可乐晚安，晚风晚安，整书听眠晚安，罐罐晚安，胆大清纯晚安。等会儿。哇，卢卡斯晚安 ，XN 晚安，天呐，努晚安，银河浪里小白龙晚安，杨小火尾晚安，呼呼晚安，尼普晚安 ，NF 晚安，南方世界第二美，哇，你这名字真敢取，晚安，南总家的没错晚安，这是什么字？等我搜会儿哦，一晚安，这个头像是个白 T 恤晚安，莫尘晚安，博弈晚安 ，Native 晚安，上上签晚安，书名号晚安，嘿，婷婷绝对不是甜妹晚安，无名氏晚安，所长在那晚安，从青晚安，叽叽咕咕晚安 ，NF 怪可爱居民晚安，逆思密号晚安，圆圆晚安，南方绕指晚安。小鹿爱旺仔晚安，葛宇晚安，小晚安 ，Memory 晚安，用户151759414924晚安，南总家的玄晚安，米奇晚安，咸鱼晚安，月小天晚安，陈晚安，易晚安，莫晚安，陈皮晚安 ，No Near 晚安，不碰感情晚安，南方的金鱼晚安，啷个弄个难晚安，严小五晚安。只想睡觉晚安，遗忘晚安，宇宙风晚安，讲谈谈晚安，9月寻南方晚安，0932晚安，指点吧晚安 ，try 晚安，用户40980954395330晚安，南城晚安，小李子要快乐晚安，佳木晚安，明天吃什么好晚安，等风来晚安，季柯南晚安，加点芋泥晚安。听闻余生晚，西北往南方晚，等我变成光晚，别辜负了相遇晚安。因为我只能看前面200个人的名字，那没有读到名字的朋友们也晚安了。噔噔噔噔噔，我今天这么多人过生日啊。OK， 好，那安 KGLYYDA 果阿星愤青小美女派。汉堡，你压着我腿毛了。南总搞笑又幼稚。阿露露苏有在吗？啊？为什么会莫名其妙打电话的呀 ？OK， 没关系。打错了啊，都在是吗 ？OK， 好啦 ，Happy Birthday。 哎，好久没那个了，等会儿我业务忘记了，我给忘了，几天没上班，我给忘记这业务的流程了。OK， 好，那亲爱的朋友们 ，Happy Birthday！OK， 那希望安果阿星愤青小美女派你压着我腿毛，南总搞笑又幼稚，阿露露苏 KGLYYDA，Happy Birthday， 生日快乐！我们过完这个生日，哎，你说它这个东西看着，搞个黑色的蛋糕，总感觉有点奇怪耶，是吧？我都觉得它有点奇怪，这个黑色蛋糕。再整点啥？祝你生日快乐，祝你生日快乐，噔噔噔，围绕你，祝你生日快乐 ，Happy birthday to you，Happy birthday to you，Happy birthday to you。不知道这么几分钟了，你看我又断签了。好啦 ，Happy Birthday！ 我们听完这首歌吧，好吗？谢谢风吹的神枪手，谢谢毒 C 小葱的真爱你，谢谢毒 C 小葱，谢谢奶气的捏捏小脸，谢谢。我看到了，但是我没有那个补签，我不知道为什么我拧不了。那天我累的实在受不了了，我就没看，我就没签，然后这个就断掉了。这个断签会有影响吗？谢谢蓝青的真的爱你，谢谢蓝青，我有会员，我有。谢谢蓝青的真的爱你，谢谢，不要再给我买任何东西了。生日快乐，生日快乐，生日快乐。没有影响不重要啊，那不重要那就无所谓了呗。我寻思有点傻哟。OK， 好，那朋友们早点睡觉，我们明天再见，好吗？我也去休息了，我跑了几天，拉练真的给我拉的不行了，我今天晚上应该会睡得很死。OK， 那我们就明天见啦，各位晚安。辛苦海龟，辛苦小鱼，辛苦子子啦，辛苦大家的点赞。辛苦啦，那我们明天见，过生日的朋友们 Happy Birthday， 拜拜。你肚子不痛吗？你痛啊？
我刚才又吃了许多火撑了。
我也刚我有点痛。好啦，拜拜啦。来，
大家拜拜。
好啦，拜拜 ，See you， 晚安啦，明天见。
我肚子不疼，我吃饱了撑的。
See you tomorrow。谢蓝青，谢谢。我不是不拜拜，我电脑关不掉，我电脑关不掉了。哎，唯一不变的就是我的电脑依然的卡。我跟你说就很奇怪，就那一个键我关不掉，他一定要我强制性关电脑。 虽然我电脑忙，我也是知道。哎呦，它关掉了。OK， 那拜拜了，see you 了大家，明天见，晚安。